Welcome to our live stream marathon of one of Patheos' most popular series, Excavating the History of the Bible. Tonight, we're taking a look back at the episodes that dig deep into archaeology and the biblical world, pot shards, inscriptions, and city walls that bring ancient stories into sharper focus. Settle in for a binge-worthy journey through the landscapes, artifacts, and people who shaped the Bible's history. Let's begin with Episode 1, Introduction to Biblical Archaeology.
When I hear the term biblical archaeology, Indiana Jones immediately springs to mind, mostly because the two best Indiana Jones movies happen to involve artifacts mentioned in the Bible. But archaeology in practice looks a lot different from archaeology on screen. There are no booby-trapped boulders or bombs. Instead, most archaeologists spend their time at libraries, labs, and archaeological sites, where they sift through material remains to reveal how people lived, worked, ate, socialized, and worshipped. And when it comes to biblical archaeology, well, that opens up a whole new set of issues. See, archaeology is the study of material remains, and the Bible, obviously, is a text. In the family of archaeology, a lot of professionals view biblical archaeology as an odd sibling because it's a field that allows a text to set the agenda, allows a text to set the questions we ask of the material data. However, as the archaeologist Aaron Brody argues, archaeology is notoriously bad at answering questions related to short-term or political history. The lifetime of any one individual is brief, and rarely, if ever, leaves behind archaeological traces. So, even a biblical character as famous or infamous as King Saul is almost impossible to find in the material record. What archaeology is good at is answering other types of questions related to medium and long-term histories, such as questions about society, economics, religion, resource procurement, farming. From excavations at these sites, researchers can piece together information about a bunch of different aspects of daily life, such as how did they manufacture their pottery, who did they trade with, what crops did they farm, what animals did they domesticate, what did their houses look like. Topics rarely covered in biblical texts. Archaeology is less equipped to detail the sort of exciting stories we see in the Bible. Abraham's travels from Ur to Canaan, the exploits of Samson versus the Philistines, royal rivalries between King Saul and the future King David. For that information, we have to disentangle the texts and textual layers preserved in the Hebrew Bible, texts that are often written centuries after the events they describe. In this series, we will examine what archaeology reveals about the cultures mentioned in the Bible. And while we'll discuss the biblical text when it's relevant, I want to focus primarily on the material evidence. But first, we have to look at the discipline's earliest explorers, whose discoveries, methods, and theories forever changed the way we think about the Bible. Let's start with someone that many consider to be the father of biblical archaeology, the 19th century biblical scholar and minister Edward Robinson. Like many of his peers, he viewed the Bible as a fundamentally historical document, a key to unlocking the biblical past. And his theological training motivated him to seek out evidence for biblical sites, people, and events on the ground as a way to prove the veracity of the Bible. So, equipped with the Bible on one hand and a map in the other, Robinson set out for the Holy Land in 1838 on a mission to identify the location of places mentioned in the Bible. And he was pretty good at it. He and his team identified a bunch of archaeological sites by matching modern Arabic place names with their hypothesized ancient Hebrew names as they would have been known in the biblical text. A famous example is the town that in Arabic is called Beitin, which Robinson identified as Bethel or Beit El in Hebrew, where the patriarch Jacob famously saw a vision of God and angels in the book of Genesis. In both of these closely related Semitic languages, the place names share the linguistic root Beit, meaning house. Robinson was also an expert map maker, and using modern scientific methods of survey to map the Holy Land, he helped to professionalize the emerging field of what was then called biblical geography. Equipped with his surveying tools and Bible, he and his team eventually identified around 100 biblical places. Robinson was not alone in his methods of tracking down ancient places using a text as his guide. The German explorer Heinrich Schliemann wanted to identify ancient Greek places mentioned in the works of Homer, and with the Iliad in one hand and his shovel in the other, Schliemann went on a self-appointed quest to dig up the famous city of Troy. However, while Schliemann would always have been faced with the potential that Troy was a mythical place from Homer's imagination, early Holy Land theologian explorers like Robinson understood the Bible as beyond question. Although Robinson was pretty successful, he did miss some of the major biblical towns, including Joshua's Jericho and Lachish, the site of a famous battle between King Hezekiah's forces and the Assyrians. Unlike the example of Bethel, the modern Arabic names of these places did not bear any resemblance to their biblical Hebrew counterparts. He failed to identify these famous biblical cities because he did not understand the phenomenon of tells. The ruins of long-lived ancient settlements often appear today in the shape of tall mounds or hills that in Arabic and Hebrew are called tells. Remember, Robinson was living during the infancy of archaeology as a modern academic discipline, and some of the basic principles that archaeologists now take for granted were not yet established. One of these tenets is the principle of superposition, which sounds pretty fancy, but it's a really simple idea. This principle holds that in any accumulation of stuff, the layers at the bottom are the oldest, with each layer progressively younger in ascending order toward the top. So think of tells as a layer cake in the shape of a tall trapezoid-shaped mound. As humans live in one place, century after century, the material remains of daily life build up layer on top of layer. These superimposed layers, known in archaeology as stratigraphic levels, record the history of a settlement from its oldest remains at the base to its youngest at the top. Although this might just look like a big hill of boring dirt, these layers contain artifacts in their original contexts that archaeologists excavate, analyze, and interpret to understand the past. Robinson was among the first biblical archaeologists, inspiring an entire generation of late 19th century explorers to launch a frenzied search for traces of biblical civilizations. A few of these finds were huge sensations in their time. For example, check out this object, the so-called Mesha stele found in Jordan. This stone inscription, which dates to the 9th century BCE, is written in Moabite, an ancient Semitic language of the Iron Age people of the land of Moab mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. And what was so special about the inscription? Well, the inscription records the accomplishments and defeats of King Mesha of Moab, including a reference to Moab's subjugation at the hands of Omri, king of Israel, the very same king mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. So, by naming an entity called Israel and its king as Omri, the Mesha stele confirmed the existence of an Israelite king who reigned in the 800s BCE. It is a hugely valuable object for historians because it shows the Moabite perspective of the same account that is presented from the Israelite perspective in 2 Kings. The discovery of the Mesha stele in the 1800s sent shockwaves through the field of biblical studies. Biblical scholars viewed it as a smoking gun for the veracity of the Bible, an extra-biblical source that confirmed a historical event in the Bible. But not so fast. There's a flip side to exciting discoveries like this: archaeology's potential to contradict the biblical text. If it could prove the text, archaeology could also challenge it and raise questions about the historicity of the Bible. As gaps between the text and archaeology came to light, archaeologists began to question a Bible-centric approach to their research. Yes, Robinson's legacy still looms large in the fields of biblical studies and biblical archaeology, but today's archaeologists are less interested in proving the stories of the Bible and more interested in understanding the context of the biblical world. Many scholars have turned toward new approaches rooted in anthropology, motivated to understand broader social and historical questions that relate little, if at all, to the Bible. Let's start with how archaeologists identify and excavate archaeological sites. While excavation is probably the most famous archaeological practice, archaeologists need to identify sites to dig up in the first place. This is done in a bunch of different ways, but archaeological survey is the most well-known. Because we're dealing with thousands of years of history, ancient settlements might be covered by modern construction or be buried deep underground by centuries of accumulated remains, such as layers of trash, debris, and natural buildup of sediment from erosion and water. In order to identify these sites, archaeologists conduct pedestrian surveys, which involves teams of archaeologists walking across open terrain collecting archaeological finds from the surface. They also conduct aerial surveys, using visual and multispectral imaging from drones and satellites, and geophysical survey methods, such as ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, both of which can help an archaeologist figure out what might lie buried underground. Once an area of ancient remains is identified, the next step is excavation. Excavation involves digging targeted areas with the goal of finding out the basic history of the site through analyzing its stratigraphy, meaning the site's superimposed layers that I mentioned earlier. The order of the layers from top to bottom can be dated using techniques like tree ring dating, radiocarbon dating, and dating with pottery, forming a sequence of pottery types and then matching them up across different sites. The archaeologist Cynthia Schaefer-Elliott uses the example of smartphones. If you're an Apple iPhone fan, you can probably identify what year a certain iPhone dates to. The styles change subtly from year to year. In the same way, archaeologists can date pieces of pottery based on style or material. Together, this evidence enables archaeologists to determine when, for how long, by whom, and how a site was used. Was it used for habitation, trash, industrial activities, food processing, farming, storage, burial, or many other possibilities? The next step is analyzing the finds that are actually collected during excavation. We humans leave behind a lot of stuff. I often think about how plastics will be an important artifact for future archaeologists to understand life in the 21st century, because a plastic object can take hundreds and hundreds of years to decompose in a landfill. When it comes to ancient contexts, archaeologists start by identifying the object's material: stone, ceramic, bone, or metal, as well as the artifact's typology, meaning how an artifact can be classified into categories. Specialists can conduct more detailed analyses of objects, looking for clues about how it was made, where the source material came from, and marks that show wear and tear and repairs. So for a graphic example, bone experts determined that the Philistines ate dogs since they identified marks on dog bones from Philistine sites that showed that the dog was butchered by humans for consumption. At the cutting edge is microarchaeology, the study of archaeological remains at the microscopic level. Microarchaeology has helped us reconstruct the diets of ancient people in particular. Paleobotany involves identifying preserved plant remains, often in the form of charred seeds and pits. This information tells us what plants people were farming, foraging, and eating, or what plants they were using as material for crafting or clothing. Other techniques try to reveal new insights on the chemical level. So one example would be residue analysis, which is a way of identifying what organic materials a vessel may have contained. The idea is that stable molecules like fatty acids seep into the pores of the clay and are preserved for centuries. These molecules are extracted and analyzed to determine what materials that vessel must have contained. So, for example, at the site of Tel Megiddo, a recent residue analysis of a juglet from the Middle Bronze Age found the world's earliest known use of vanillin, the main aromatic and flavor compound in vanilla. The study turned previous research on vanilla on its head. So archaeologists used to think that vanilla was first domesticated by the Aztecs in the 1300s. But this new evidence instead changed everything. Vanilla must have first been domesticated 3,000 years earlier and halfway across the globe in Southwest Asia. These are just a few examples of the potential of archaeology to change the narrative of history, pushing the boundaries of current knowledge of ancient peoples and challenging the status quo of biblical history. Over the course of this series, we'll examine different topics related to the Bible. In some cases, like the Canaanites and the Philistines, the Bible tells us so little that archaeology gives these people groups a new voice for the first time in centuries. We'll be starting in the Middle to Late Bronze Age, so stay tuned for Episode 2, The Canaanites. Hey everyone, that was episode 1 of a new series that I'm producing in collaboration with Patheos. It's called Excavating the History of the Bible. You can watch episode 2 right now, so just head on over to Patheos' brand new YouTube channel. You can subscribe and follow the whole series as we launch each episode weekly. Topics will include who were the Canaanites, where did the Israelites come from, who were the Philistines, examining the cultures and places mentioned in the Bible from an anthropological and archaeological perspective. So each and every episode is written by an archaeologist or a biblical scholar, so special thanks to all the awesome people down in the credits below. I could not have made this series without their help. So head on over to Patheos' YouTube channel to watch episode 2, Who Were the Canaanites?
From tools and trenches to the stories in the soil, we move from how archaeology works to the world of the Canaanites. Urban centers, palaces, and diplomacy shaping late Bronze Age life. Here's something fascinating before we continue. The Amarna letters were written mainly in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the day. And here's another detail worth noting. Edward Robinson is often called the father of biblical archaeology for linking ancient sites to modern place names. All right, let's step into Canaan.
There are a lot of ites in the Bible. The Israelites, the Amalekites, the Moabites, the Hittites, but among the ones to receive the worst reputation are the Canaanites. The Bible doesn't say too much about the Canaanites, but the main narrative comes from the book of Joshua. The Canaanites were a people destined to be conquered. After Moses' death, Joshua was called to lead the people of Israel into the land of Canaan, a land today roughly spanning the modern state of Israel, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Jordan, Lebanon, and southern Syria. Upon entering the land, Joshua and the Israelites defeat Jericho, a strong-walled Canaanite city, but they continue to do a lot of conquering, culminating in Joshua 12, which lists 31 Canaanite kings whom Joshua and the Israelites apparently defeated. The focus is somewhat different in the book of Judges. Here we get lots of statements about the Israelite tribes not driving out Canaanites, nor destroying their cities. The focus is very much on the Israelites as God's chosen people, and the Canaanites as conquered peoples that continue to infiltrate the Israelites and lead them astray. But let's set aside Joshua and Judges for a moment as we turn to the archaeological evidence to answer the question, who were the Canaanites, and what happened to them? Archaeologists view the Canaanites as the main population and native cultural group of the Bronze Age in this region before the appearance of the Israelites. And as we'll see from the archaeology, the Canaanites lived in big cities, worshipped in big temples, and survived under the thumb of the Egyptian Empire. Let's focus in on the 1300s BCE. Canaan during the Late Bronze Age. This was a region on the edge of Egyptian imperial control. Though not a significant center of power, Canaan played a crucial role as a cultural and commercial crossroads. See, there were two major road systems, the coastal route and the King's Highway, that connected Egypt with Syria, Mesopotamia, and ultimately the whole Aegean world via the Mediterranean coast. Canaan sat at the heart of it all. These routes spurred the development of long-distance trade that financed some of the biggest cultural achievements of the Canaanites that we'll talk about, including their urban culture, their monumental architecture, palace bureaucracies, and their cult practice. I want to focus on the 1300s because we get a pretty clear snapshot of the political situation in Canaan during this time because of the Amarna letters, a huge cache of clay tablets discovered in Egypt dating to a few decades in the Late Bronze Age. Basically, they comprised an administrative archive. Of the almost 400 known tablets, a big percentage of them record correspondences between Egyptian officials and the kings of small city-states in Canaan. For example, a few letters are from the Canaanite king of Ashkelon, a coastal city known as a major trading center due to its location along the coastal road. Notice how servile and obsequious the Canaanite king is to the pharaoh. He calls the pharaoh my king, my lord, my god, and he calls himself your servant, the dirt at your feet, the groom of your horses. He promises to the pharaoh that he'll continue to guard Ashkelon in accordance with the command of the king. Another letter is from the king Abdi-Heba, from a city you might have heard before, Urushalim, or Jerusalem. King Abdi-Heba begs the pharaoh to send reinforcements as he skirmishes with other Canaanite city-states. Letters like these are important in reconstructing Canaanite society, as well as political, economic, and religious relations with the Egyptians. They clearly illustrate the tight Egyptian grip on the region. Canaanite kings were sending them tribute, acting as vassals of the Egyptian empire, and begging the Egyptian leaders to settle disputes. This control is also evident in just how much Egyptian stuff turns up in Bronze Age excavations in the region. For example, check out the city of Beit Shan, located a few kilometers south of the Sea of Galilee. On top of the Tell, archaeologists discovered an Egyptian administrative center, including an Egyptian temple, the house of an Egyptian governor, and Egyptian inscriptions. These remains suggest that a bunch of Egyptians must have been stationed at different Canaanite sites, serving both administrative and military functions despite the distance from the Egyptian heartland. Overall, the role of Egypt in the Late Bronze Age was not to colonize Canaan, but rather to administer the collection of tribute, to impose security arrangements, and enforce a semblance of order on the quarrelsome Canaanite rulers. The material evidence from Late Bronze Age Canaan provides an excellent case study for identifying political activities of a dominant and imperialistic Egyptian power. Another thing we learn from the Amarna letters is that the Canaanites were by and large an urban civilization. The region was basically a collection of city-states. The tablets mention approximately 20 of them. This includes Jerusalem, as well as lesser-known cities like Megiddo, Gezer, Hatzor, and Ashkelon, all major Canaanite cities that you can visit to this day. Many of them had impressive fortifications. For example, check out this huge gate at Ashkelon. Built mostly of brick and limestone, the gate is 15 meters long. This is some pretty impressive infrastructure for its time. Another great example of Canaanite urban living is Megiddo. You might have heard of it before. The Bible mentions it about a dozen times, including the book of Revelation, where it says that at the end of time, a great battle will be fought at Armageddon, or Har Megiddo, the Mound of Megiddo. Located in the Jezreel Valley, Megiddo was strategically situated on a trade route, making it the ideal setting to become super wealthy and super powerful. In the Bronze Age, Megiddo was a big deal. It had huge fortifications, including a multi-chamber gate and a mud brick wall that enclosed the city. Throughout the Bronze Age, the inhabitants constructed monumental palaces and fancy houses for the elites. It was one of the crowning jewels of Canaanite civilization. So, Canaanites liked their urban living, and another key aspect of this city lifestyle was their religion. Now, the Bible mentions Canaanite religion here and there, usually tied to the god Baal, but we learn a lot more from the archaeology. Some of these major Canaanite cities that we've mentioned so far had big temples right in the city center. These were monumental temples with 2 or 3 rooms, including an inner sanctuary that scholars sometimes call a Holy of Holies, borrowing language from the Temple of Solomon from the Hebrew Bible. We find temples like this at Megiddo, but the city of Hatzor is another great example. Hatzor is located north of the Sea of Galilee and was a major Canaanite hub in the Bronze Age, the largest Canaanite city in the southern Levant. The book of Joshua even calls it the head of all Canaanite kingdoms. Hatzor covered about 200 acres of space, which encompasses several temples, including a huge ceremonial precinct on the top, variously identified as a palace or a temple. So, what gods were Canaanites worshipping at these sites? Well, there were a lot of Canaanite gods, but I want to focus on 2 in particular. In one of the rooms in that huge precinct at Hatzor, archaeologists discovered a bronze statue of a god dating to the 14th century BCE. And it's pretty hefty. 35 centimeters high, it weighs 3 kilograms of solid bronze. Many scholars think it represents the Levantine storm god Baal, based on his clothing and his gesture with his hand held parallel to his chest, which is identified as one of Baal's attributes. But as much press as Baal gets in the Hebrew Bible, like the prophet Elijah fighting against the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings, he actually was not the head of the Canaanite pantheon. In a lot of Canaanite traditions, that honor goes to the god El. What you're looking at is a figure of the god El, discovered at Megiddo, and dated to about the 1300s BCE. Standing at 27 centimeters high, it's a bronze object coated entirely in gold. El is depicted holding in his left hand a spatula-shaped scepter that could be interpreted as an emblem of the god. Similar spatula scepters have been found around the region, including at Hatzor and Lachish, which some scholars argue may have been held by life-size statues of the gods that have since been lost. Both Baal and El were also associated with a calf or bull as their animal manifestation, and archaeologists have found figurines of these animals at several Canaanite sites. So, from the archaeological data, we can sketch an image of the Canaanites. They were the native people of the Levantine region, living in city-states like Hatzor, Gezer, and Megiddo, worshipping gods like El and Baal in big temples located in their cities. But these city-states did not form a single political unit. They all lived under the shadow of the Egyptian Empire. While the book of Joshua says that the Israelites invaded Canaan after fleeing Egypt and destroyed the Canaanites, the archaeological data appears to primarily say that the Egyptians dominated the Canaanites. Numerous excavations and a bunch of contemporary written documents in the form of the Amarna letters give us a pretty good picture of the Canaanites, their beliefs, and their traditions during the Late Bronze Age. Yes, most of this period was characterized by an Egyptian dominance and influence, but Canaan served as a cultural crossroads of the region that was essential to Egyptian strategic goals. But Canaanite culture, for all of its achievements, was not to last. The so-called Late Bronze Age collapse was a time of economic and environmental turmoil, leading to the fall of superpowers like the Hittite Empire. Canaanite urban society could not be sustained following the collapse of the Late Bronze Age and the implosion of long-distance trade. In the decades that followed, the Canaanites gradually transformed culturally as new groups emerged, including the Phoenicians, the Israelites, and the Philistines. Stay tuned, we'll be learning more about these people groups in future episodes. Hey everyone, that was the second episode in the brand new Patheos series, Excavating the History of the Bible. If you'd like to watch episode 1, you should click on the link right here. Stay tuned for episode 3, which will be focusing on the origins of the Israelites.
Leaving Canaan's fortified cities, the story turns inland to the highlands, where early Israel emerges as a farming and pastoral society. Quick fact from the dig sites: the Merneptah stele, dated around 1208 BCE, is the earliest mention of Israel in the archaeological record. One more insight before we roll. Scholars caution that the Hebrew mentioned in the Amarna letters are not the same as the Hebrews. Let's head to the hill country.
At its core, the Hebrew Bible is the story of a people called the Israelites. It tells of their origins, their struggles, and their special relationship to the God that they call Yahweh. But who exactly are the Israelites and where did they come from? As we talked about last episode, according to the book of Joshua, the Israelites are depicted as conquerors of Canaan and its idol-worshipping inhabitants, the Canaanites. It's the sequel to the Exodus narrative, the fulfillment of their divine right to the promised land which was bestowed by God upon the Israelites' forefather, the patriarch Abraham. A reward that finally comes to fruition after 40 years of wandering the desert after escaping slavery in Egypt. The text goes on to tell of how Joshua led the tribes of Israel through Canaan, capturing city after city until they vanquished their enemies and inherited their birthright. They then settled the land and divided it geographically, with each tribe of Israel getting a piece of the pie. But the origins of the Israelites in the archaeological record is not so clear-cut. That's because the book of Joshua was not written at the same time as the events it describes. In fact, the text contains certain details that reveal that the story was written long after these events. For example, the walls of Jericho described in Joshua did not exist in the Late Bronze Age, nor did many of the place names given in the text. These places did exist in the 7th century, though, which is when many scholars agree that the story was likely written down. The archaeological evidence tells a different tale. Early Israelites were simple farmers living on the edges of civilization. But where did they come from? To answer this question, let's first turn to the historical record and the earliest documents that mention the group known as Israel. This is the Merneptah stele, a 10-foot tall black granite stone discovered in Thebes by the famous Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie in 1896. Inscribed on the stone are Egyptian hieroglyphs that record military victories over some of Egypt's neighbors by the pharaoh Merneptah. a pharaoh of Egypt's 19th dynasty who ruled from 1213 to 1203 BCE, during a critical period of change, upheaval, and instability across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Monuments like this were typical of pharaohs, who loved to brag about their victories for all to see. But this monument is so important because it contains one of the oldest known written references to Israel. This was a sensational find when it was first discovered, during the height of Egypt mania in the 19th century Victorian era. Its legacy has endured over a century later. The problem? Its mysterious Israel inscription raises many more questions than it answers regarding who or what exactly Israel was from Merneptah's perspective. Was it a group of people that correspond to the biblical Israelites, a nation, a territory, or something else entirely? Let's take a look at the details. The ancient Egyptian language provides some clues. See, the name Israel appears alongside several adversaries that Merneptah claims to have defeated, including the city of Ashkelon. The monument lists these enemies in a number of ways, such as by their general region, such as Canaan, or by their capital city, such as Ashkelon. In the Egyptian language, foreign countries, cities, and provinces are linguistically feminine, but when referring to Israel, the inscription marks it differently. It uses a different determinative, a linguistically masculine marker that indicates a foreign people. Why use the linguistic marker for people rather than land or nation? In this case, Israel may refer to a society, a coherent group of people who shared a collective identity. Based on the inscription, some biblical scholars interpret Israel as a tribe that may derive its name or identity from an ancestor by the same name. The stele goes a step further, triumphantly claiming that Israel's seed has perished, a phrase that is not applied to the other entities listed in this victory stele. These clues tell us about how the Egyptians viewed Israel as something different from the other entities that they list. It's not a land like Canaan or a city like Ashkelon, but a people who, according to the Egyptians, perished by around 1207 BCE as a result of their military defeat. But there's a twist to the story. Although long thought to be the oldest inscription mentioning Israel, a new artifact might take the crown from the Merneptah stele. The late scholar Manfred George translated an even older fragment of an Egyptian text called by the super creative name AM 21687, which is housed in the New Museum in Berlin. He argued that the inscription includes the name of Israel on a damaged portion of the inscription, which has been confirmed by other scholars in recent years. But in this case, the name refers to a topography or a region rather than naming a people group like the Merneptah stele. Some biblical scholars and archaeologists suggest that the fragment could date to the reign of the pharaoh Haramhab, who ruled from 1319 to 1292, or Pharaoh Ramses II, who ruled from 1279 to 1213 BCE. But in either case, it could indicate an even older existence of an entity called Israel before Merneptah. Now, the Amarna letters contain equally mysterious references to a group in Canaan who are called the Habiru or Aparu, a word that means dusty or dirty. In one letter, the king of Byblos complains to Pharaoh that all of my cities, which are situated in the mountains or along the sea, have sided with the Habiru people. Basically, he's complaining about an unholy alliance between his own disloyal subjects and the Habiru. Another letter disparagingly compares the Habiru people to a stray dog, the ultimate insult for the ancient Near East. Eventually, more sources with this name appeared from across the Near East, from sites in Egypt, Syria, Canaan, and Mesopotamia. Scholars have grappled with whether or not these Habiru might be related to the Hebrews, a biblical name that is associated with the inhabitants of ancient Israel, who eventually became a group known as the Israelites. So, who are these Habiru? The Amarna letters imply that the Habiru may have been a transient group who inhabited the hilly outskirts of major cities. There is some indication that they were low status and disrupted trade by raiding and plundering traveling merchants. In other words, they were bandits. They were also described as slaves and servants. The king of Gezer implies that they were sometimes even organized as a force. In a letter to the pharaoh, he begs for help to save his land from the power of the Habiru, and in another describes them as a stronger force than his own. So, viewing the Habiru through this negative lens leads us to draw the conclusion that they were a marginalized social class who sometimes formed powerful militias, rather than a group defined by their nationhood, culture, religion, or language, like the Israelites. Like other groups mentioned in the Amarna letters, they were presented in these letters as a source of danger to an already crumbling system of long-distance trade. So, do these bandits represent the Hebrews? Probably not. The connection between the Habiru and the Hebrews is linguistic and relies on matching the root letters of the words themselves. And most scholars agree that the root letters don't even match. So any direct connection between the Habiru and the Hebrews is unlikely. Where does that leave us in terms of the Israelites? Well, given the conflicting historical evidence, we are left to read between the lines to determine how Israel and its people may or may not correlate with the archaeology. Although the sources don't agree on much, one thing is clear. The Late Bronze Age was a world undergoing conflict, change, and crisis. During the Late Bronze Age, the status quo began to crumble across the Eastern Mediterranean. Palace economies and the long-distance trade that they supported disintegrated. The imperial superpowers of the time, Egypt and the Hittites, either retreated home from their peripheries or completely collapsed. People were on the move, migrating in droves from the Aegean to the Levant. A letter from the palace archive of a coastal Syrian city dated to around 1207 BCE bore witness to burning cities. "My father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They have been setting fire to my cities and have done harm to the land." Another letter from the same city paints an even bleaker picture. "The gates of the house are sealed. Since there is famine in your house, we shall starve to death." This letter may have been sent from the inland city of Amar, showing just how far the disruption had spread, with famines raging from central Anatolia all the way to Egypt. The shockwaves of these changes reverberated around the region. Some existing cities were abandoned, but new ones were founded in the highlands and along the coast, and new groups of people settled in the area. Some of the new groups included the Philistines, who settled on the coast, and the Israelites, who gravitated toward the difficult terrain of the rural highlands to establish new villages away from the Canaanite urban centers. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age burst the bubble of long-distance trade, a lucrative enterprise that had propped up Canaanite palace economies and urban centers for centuries. In its wake, Canaanite urban culture also gradually collapsed as depleted palace treasuries became unable to sustain large populations in their cities and outskirts. Populations shrank, and new areas in the central highlands were settled, possibly by pastoral nomads, who were mobile groups of herdsmen who moved seasonally with their flocks. These new highland villages were located in marginal environmental zones between the Jezreel Valley to the north and the Beersheba Valley in the south. The hilly topography made farming really difficult, with limited crop yields that could only support small populations, especially in the arid south. Without the surplus crops supplied by Canaanite city-states in exchange for dairy, wool, and meat supplied by the herders, these pastoralists had turned to other means of subsistence. So people were forced to adapt to their new socioeconomic conditions, starting with producing their own food through subsistence farming and animal husbandry. The thing about agriculture is that it requires staying in one place to tend the crops, so this shift also had the secondary effect of establishing permanent villages for populations who had previously migrated seasonally. The first signs of this new group emerged around 1200 BCE in newly founded villages in the highlands like Isbet Sarta, Kirbet Radana, and Tel Naspa. Notice the small, roughly built houses and small grain silos. These remains of the Israelite village of Isbet Sarta are much smaller in scale than the big Canaanite urban centers we saw last episode. This is about all the infrastructure that we see in early Iron Age villages like these. No public buildings like palaces, no temples, no water systems or city storehouses. All of this would slowly appear again a few hundred years later. These remains tell us that the early Israelites appear to have lived a simple and egalitarian lifestyle of small-scale farming and herding. They shared living space, they shared labor, livestock, and silos for storing grain. From the 12th century through about the 8th century BCE, settlements that were scattered sparsely in the hills at first eventually grew to number in the hundreds as the Israelite population grew. They gradually formed a network of villages, towns, and fortified centers that transformed over time into important Israelite highland cities such as Shiloh, Bethel, and Jerusalem. So the simplest explanation for the origins of the Israelites might be the closest to the mark. As scholars Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman argue in their book, The Bible Unearthed, the emergence of early Israel was an outcome of the collapse of the Canaanite culture, not its cause. And most of the Israelites did not come from outside Canaan, they emerged from within it. How do we know that these settlements were uniquely Israelite? Well, these villagers developed new forms of material culture, such as the collar-rimmed jar, which is often used as a marker of Israelite identity. They also developed distinctive architecture, such as the pillared 3- or 4-room house. They appear to have adopted new dietary rules too, in part avoiding eating pigs. Finally, they developed new religious practice centered on the worship of the God of Israel. This explanation of a gradual transition from Canaanites to Israelites also helps to explain why vestiges of Canaanite culture endured among Israelite populations for centuries. The Israelites set up open-air cult sanctuaries on hilltops where worshippers would go to deposit religious figurines. Female figurines were especially popular and may have represented Asherah. Now, of course, the emergence of any people group is an incredibly complex process, and archaeologists continue to debate the origins of the Israelites. Archaeologists see continuity with Canaanite culture, such as pottery derived directly from Canaanite styles, as well as the continuity with Canaanite cultic practice, such as the Asherah figurines. But archaeologists also note discontinuity from Canaanites of the Bronze Age, like the new settlement patterns and more egalitarian social structure exemplified by these small hamlets in the central hill country, a far cry from the grand urban lifestyle of Canaanite cities like Ashkelon, Hatzor, or Megiddo. Scholars of the past few decades have offered modifications of this pastoral Canaanite model that I've outlined in this video. For example, the scholar Anne Killebrew has floated what she calls the mixed multitude theory of Israelite origins, that early Israel was a collection of largely indigenous tribal groups, mostly comprised of the rural Canaanite population and displaced peasants and pastoralists, but the boundaries of this group may have been porous, enabling smaller numbers from external non-indigenous groups from outside Canaan to integrate into the new ethnicity. However, material culture or religious practice alone do not define the Israelites as a people. What binds together a group of people as an ethnicity or a nation like the Israelites is a shared narrative of common origins, descent, and identity. That's the work of the Hebrew Bible, to bring together the historical threads of the Israelites as a people and package the story through the special relationship with Yahweh. The story of the conquest of Canaan told in the book of Joshua serves to fulfill the very goal of creating a national origin story for the Israelite people. It better reflects the 7th century world of Judah in which it was written than the world of 12th century Canaan that it describes. Stay tuned for the next episode. Philistines are next. That was episode 3 of Patheos' new series, Excavating the History of the Bible, where we explore the world of the Bible through the lens of archaeology. Click on the playlist on screen to watch the first 2 episodes.
From Israel's uplands, we shift to the coast, where the Philistines leave their mark with Aegean-style pottery and fortified cities. Here's a surprising connection. Philistine ceramics often reflect Mycenaean influences, marking an Aegean link. And another clue from Egypt. Earliest Philistine references appear in Egyptian inscriptions, tracing their arrival. Now, let's meet the Philistines.
This is the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III, located at Medinet Habu near Luxor, Egypt. Inscribed on the walls of this temple is the earliest archaeological reference to one of the greatest villains in the Hebrew Bible, the Philistines. They're always causing trouble for biblical heroes. They gouge out Samson's eyes before he drops a building on a bunch of them. They steal the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem, and they famously lose their champion Goliath in a duel against David. But who were the Philistines, and where did they come from? And what have archaeologists discovered about their culture? Let's turn back to those carvings on the walls of Medinet Habu. This inscription describes a series of attacks up and down the Levantine coast by a coalition of seafaring armies, culminating in an invasion of Egypt in the 1170s BCE. The inscription reads, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. No land could stand before their arms. They were coming forward toward Egypt." The inscription then describes the distinct people groups attacking Egypt. Their confederation was the Peleset, the Tejeker, the Shekelesh, the Denian, and the Wesha. And here they are, at least according to the Egyptian artists, a bunch of foreign soldiers with nifty feathered headdresses and distinctly different features compared to the Egyptians. One section of the sculpture depicts Ramses III standing before a dramatic naval battle. Egyptian and invaders' boats crushed together, foreign soldiers falling overboard. Another section depicts the same feathered invaders carried off as prisoners. Scholars now call these people the Sea Peoples. They start appearing in Egyptian sources around 1400 BCE, and by 1100 they apparently were a huge thorn in the side of the Egyptians. A bunch of different primary sources from the New Kingdom period suggest that the Egyptian Empire frequently dealt with Sea People attacks. Now, throughout the 20th century, some scholars even blamed the Sea Peoples as the cause of the so-called Late Bronze Age collapse, an apparently widespread phenomenon when the Eastern Mediterranean region succumbed to a gradual process of political, economic, social, and cultural fragmentation. The superpowers of that time, the Hittite Empire and the Egyptians, were in crisis. The Hittite Empire itself dissolved entirely. Major cities in the Eastern Mediterranean either were destroyed or disappeared. International trade apparently dried up. The argument goes that the Sea Peoples were a primary cause. Invaders from Crete, Cyprus, mainland Greece, and even as far away as Sardinia, coming in and trashing the Levant. However, archaeologists in recent years have modified this Sea Peoples invasion narrative. As with any large-scale historical phenomenon, it's way too simplistic to blame a single cause. The Late Bronze Age collapse was a slow-moving phenomenon that took place over the course of a century or more. In fact, the Sea Peoples might have been victims of the Late Bronze Age collapse themselves, escaping from their homelands as refugees. As the archaeologist Eric Klein argues, we really shouldn't think of the Sea Peoples as waves of organized armies like the Crusades, but probably more like loosely or poorly organized groups. The Egyptian sources, like the mortuary temple of Ramses III, show that these groups apparently had women, children, household goods, and even livestock with them. This motley crew hardly resembles a menacing army. Taken as a whole, the archaeological evidence seems to indicate that some Sea Peoples may have settled the Eastern Mediterranean by force, but others peacefully. So, what does all of this have to do with the Philistines? Well, remember that list of Sea Peoples mentioned at Medinet Habu? Let's focus on the first one mentioned, the Peleset. Or, more accurately, since ancient Egyptian does not have vowels, the PLST. Scholars have identified these people as none other than the Philistines themselves. Not only is the name linguistically related to the name Philistine, another Egyptian source dating to around the same time period locates the Peleset in 3 cities in southern Canaan: Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza, cities famously known to be part of the kingdom of Philistia according to the Bible. So, this is the general backstory of the Philistines. They were one of several so-called Sea Peoples, possibly with roots in the Aegean world, maybe Cyprus or possibly southern Anatolia, who migrated to southern Canaan around 1200 BCE, establishing a kingdom based around several major cities, including Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Gath, and Ekron. But what is the evidence for connecting the Philistines to Aegean cultures? Let's start with the pottery. Remember that pottery is a powerful tool that archaeologists use to date and identify ancient sites, kind of like how we could identify the decade a cell phone belongs to by how it's designed. Archaeologists can link pottery to certain cultures and centuries based on the pottery's style, material, and decorations. And when it comes to the Philistines, archaeologists have discovered Aegean-style pottery at Philistine cities. Check out this photograph. We're looking at an example of Mycenaean 3C pottery, discovered on the Aegean island of Kalymnos. Archaeologists have discovered similar examples in other Aegean sites on Cyprus and mainland Greece. Now, check this out. See any similarities? Light color, dark brown paint? Well, the first picture is an example of Mycenaean 3C pottery from a Greek island. The second example is Mycenaean 3C1 pottery, or more simply nicknamed Philistine monochrome. Yes, this vessel was discovered in the Philistine city of Ekron, so notice the crazy close similarities to Aegean-style pottery. And in fact, archaeologists have discovered Mycenaean 3C1 pottery all over Philistine cities dating to the early Iron Age period. And it was pretty common. At the city of Ekron, for example, Mycenaean 3C1 pottery accounts for somewhere between 40 to 50% of all pottery discovered that dates to the early 12th century. So, what does this tell us about the Philistines and their culture? Archaeologists in the 1970s theorized that the Philistines must have taken this pottery with them from their homelands in the Aegean, or Cyprus itself, when they migrated to their new land. But after studying the pottery using a chemical technique called neutron activation analysis, researchers discovered that these pots were not imports. They were locally produced, created from the same clay found in Philistia itself. In fact, clay with the same chemical fingerprint that we see in later Philistine styles, like Philistine bichrome pottery. So this leads scholars to conclude that the Philistines were making this pottery for themselves, using Aegean-style manufacturing technologies never before seen in the Levant, but not as mere imitators of the style, but as people who migrated to Philistia, carrying with them the technical know-how to continue these styles from a parent culture somewhere in the Aegean world. Here's another example. You're looking at a figurine called an Ashdoda figurine. Basically, she's a female figurine that some archaeologists identify as some sort of Philistine goddess, though in this case, half goddess, half offering table. Archaeologists have discovered similar figurines at major Philistine sites, including Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, dating to as early as the second half of the 12th century. Now, check out these figurines. Archaeologists call these psi figurines. Because of their elongated necks and raised arms, they look kind of like the Greek letter psi. The examples on the left were found in Greece, Crete, and Cyprus. The example on the right from the Philistine city of Ashdod. Again, we might be looking at evidence of a people that carried with them religious and technical knowledge from the Aegean world to the southern coast of Canaan. What about the Philistine diet? Well, according to archaeological data, Philistines apparently ate pig and dog meat, which reflect the dietary practices of Aegean cultures, but not those living in Canaan. Let's start with the pigs. In the Iron Age 1 period, we see higher frequency of pig bones at Philistine sites compared to neighboring sites. At Ashdod, almost 15% of all bones discovered by archaeologists were pig bones. Iron Age Gath? Well, between 13 and 16%. Outside of Philistia, pig bones are much more rare. This may point to higher rates of pork consumption among the Philistines. The theory goes that the Philistines brought pig culture with them from their homelands around the Aegean to the Levantine coast. Analyses of the pig bones found at these sites show that they are genetically related to European pigs. And in fact, wild boars today in Israel and the Palestinian territories are more genetically similar to European boars than those found in surrounding cultures. The Philistines also apparently ate dog meat. While dog bones are a fairly rare find in late Bronze Age Canaanite sites, at the dawn of the early Iron Age, we suddenly see a big spike in dog bones at Philistine sites. And these bones seem to point to evidence of food preparation and consumption. So, for example, archaeologists have noticed cut marks on dog bones that indicate that the Philistines were butchering dogs, and discoloration on the bones implies that they were roasting the meat. Again, this might point to their Aegean origins. Eating dogs was a known practice in mainland Greece, Crete, and the Aegean world in general. Archaeologists have found butchered dog bones all over the Aegean region, dating from the Neolithic period all the way into the Classical period. And finally, Philistine DNA may also point to European origins. A team of archaeologists extracted and analyzed DNA from 10 individuals buried in the Philistine city of Ashkelon. These skeletons date to the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, the same time period when the so-called Sea Peoples were thought to have showed up in this region. The researchers published their result in 2019, which showed that the DNA from these individuals exhibits specific European patterns, similar DNA patterns that we see in southern Europeans, in Italy, the Aegean, and southern Spain. This might suggest that the early Philistines were indeed immigrants from southern Europe, and specifically the cultures around the Aegean Sea. Though we should proceed with caution here. This study makes some pretty bold claims based on a very small sample size of 10 individuals. But taken together, the figurines, the pottery, the diet, and the DNA all point to roots in the Aegean world. But of course the origins of the Philistines are more complicated than a simple narrative of a one-way migration to Canaan. Archaeologists over the past decade argue that the Philistines were not a single ethnicity that invaded, destroyed, and replaced the Canaanites. Rather, as the archaeologist R.N. Mayer argues, they appear to have been a multicultural people comprised of various groups deriving from the eastern and central Mediterranean that joined with local Canaanites to form a unique culture. He argues it is better to describe the Philistines as an entangled society, a society with Aegean roots, but entangled in Canaanite culture. Okay, so that's the archaeological data, but let's now return to the Bible, the textual sources. How does the biblical description of Philistines jibe with the archaeology? And more specifically, what does the Bible have against the Philistines? The Bible mentions the Philistines over 250 times, and from the book of Genesis to the book of Judges, and all the way up through the books of Samuel and Kings, the story is basically the same. Near constant tension between the Philistines and their neighbors. But was there really historical tension between the Philistines and the Israelites during the time periods that these books were thought to cover? These are tricky questions to answer because most biblical scholars today agree that the texts containing the most dramatic stories about the Philistines were composed or redacted centuries later, probably during the 7th or 6th centuries BCE. In other words, hundreds of years after the period that the famous stories of Samson or King David were thought to have happened. Because of this, scholars need to identify what parts of the Hebrew Bible preserve actual memories of Iron Age Philistia, and what parts reflect the political situation of later centuries. There are basically two sides of the argument. Israel Finkelstein, one of the most prominent archaeologists of this region over the past few decades, has argued that the biblical references to the Philistines do not contain any memory of early Iron Age events or cultural behavior. Let's take the city of Gath as a case study, famously the hometown of the giant Goliath. It is the most frequently mentioned Philistine city in the book of Samuel, and many of the battles between the Israelites and the Philistines take place east of the city. But decades of excavations in and around the site of Gath, also called Tel Asafi, have revealed no evidence of hostility between the Philistines and their neighbors to the east. The biblical scholar Daniel Pioski writes that for a period of around 3 centuries, we find no clear evidence that forces from Gath ever attacked or destroyed a single location within the neighboring regions of Israel or Judah, or conversely, that it was attacked by individuals from these areas during this time. In fact, the archaeological record seems to indicate the opposite was true, as there's evidence that Gath was actively engaging in economic and cultural exchange with its neighbors to the east. The Philistine religion is another possible example of archaeology telling a different story than the text. The Bible suggests that the main Philistine god was a male god named Dagon. But the most common religious paraphernalia that we find in Philistine sites are those female figurines that we mentioned earlier, and the mention of a female goddess on an inscription found in the Philistine city of Ekron, which suggests that the main god was a goddess, not Dagon. On the other side of the coin, some archaeologists and biblical scholars do argue that the stories about the Philistines in the books of Samuel or Kings might contain kernels of actual data about Iron Age Philistines. So, for example, the very fact that the Bible mentions Gath so often is interesting because while the city was one of the biggest cities around the 10th century, Gath apparently dwindled in importance in later periods. Excavations at Tel Asafi have demonstrated that the city was destroyed by fire in the 9th or 8th century and never fully recovered. So this leads the ancient historian Itamar Singer to argue that the Hebrew Bible includes at least a memory of Iron Age Philistia, even if the text includes some pretty obvious anachronisms. Overall, the Philistines are the subject of some of the most recent and cutting-edge archaeological studies. Archaeologists discovered a major Philistine cemetery only a few years ago. Their DNA has been sequenced in detail, but a lot of their culture and society remain a mystery to this day. If you'd like to learn more about the Philistines, I'm including a bibliography in the description below, as well as links to excavations at Tel Asafi, Ashkelon, and Ekron. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode. Hey everyone, that was episode 4 of Patheos' new series, Excavating the History of the Bible. Click on the link on screen to watch the first 3 episodes, and stay tuned for episode 5, Iron Age Jerusalem.
From coastal plains to Jerusalem's hills, let's explore the city that later anchors Judah's story. Before we move on, here's a quick fact. Jerusalem's ancient infrastructure includes monumental stepped stone structures and engineered water channels. And here's another. The city's topography, a narrow ridge with steep valleys, shaped fortifications, and daily life. Let's roll into the city of David.
Looking at Jerusalem today, it would be easy to assume that the ancient city of the Canaanites, and later the Israelites, was originally located outside the old city walls that still dominate the skyline of the city today. But these walls, with their monumental gates and huge towers, are actually medieval. They date to the middle of the 16th century, built by the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent soon after Jerusalem became part of the Ottoman Empire. Research from the last 150 years actually shows us that the earliest sections of Jerusalem sat outside of these walls. In this episode, we'll examine exactly where the biblical city was located and how it developed over time. Jerusalem is complicated, especially if you haven't been there. It sits in the middle of a mountain range about half a mile above sea level, surrounded by limestone hills and crisscrossed by deep valleys in between. A good way to think about Jerusalem is by thinking of two main lines of hills, one on the west, one on the east, with a valley in between each one. This is the main core of the city. The famous Dome of the Rock stands out on the eastern side, and the hill across from it is the Western Hill. You really can't see the central valley anymore because over time it has been filled with debris since antiquity. On the outside of the eastern and western hill lines, there are two deep and prominent valleys, the Hinnom Valley on the west and south, and the Kidron Valley on the east. So, where exactly was the earliest city of Jerusalem located? By examining the writings of 19th century explorers and the first modern maps of Jerusalem, it's clear that all scholars thought that the city of the Jebusites and David was founded on the western half of the city. You might remember the American scholar and explorer Edward Robinson mentioned in episode 1. He is one scholar among many who assumed that the biblical city of David was located here. Why did he think this? Well, for one thing, there are many place names on the western side of the city that echo early biblical memory. The best example of this is that the Western Hill itself is called Mount Zion, the very name of the stronghold that the Bible says that David conquered in 2 Samuel chapter 5. If that wasn't enough, the high tower that stands on the north side of Mount Zion, just inside today's Jaffa Gate, is named the Tower of David, and the traditional tomb of King David is also located on the Western Hill. Early modern scholars interpreted this as a claim that the city of David and Solomon must be on the Western Hill. Seems like a slam dunk, right? Not so fast. Remember, archaeology wasn't even in its infancy yet. By the time Robinson died in 1863, even the most basic of excavations had not been carried out in the city. What we today would call scientific archaeology did not begin in Jerusalem until the excavations by a British archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon almost a century later. So there was no way to scientifically test the idea that David's city sat on the Western Hill. Excavations finally began in Jerusalem just after Robinson died, and the new data that started to emerge turned all of the theories upside down. Earliest Jerusalem was not on the Western Hill after all, but instead on the much lower, smaller, and less prominent southeastern ridge. Looking at the old city today, you would never guess that the city of biblical lore sat outside the monumental walls, and it would take several decades longer for this view to become the scholarly consensus. But over time, even more archaeological evidence eventually led all scholars to accept that the earliest Jerusalem was not where they once thought. So, why did ancient Jerusalem's first inhabitants establish the city on the small and less significant southeastern hill? There is probably a simple answer. At the foot of the eastern side of this hill bubbles the city's only regular source of fresh water, which is known in the Bible as the Gihon Spring. At this strategic spot, Jerusalem's inhabitants clustered near the spring and eventually built a city around it. Some of the earliest pottery in Jerusalem was found in this area. The first defensive walls of Jerusalem were built around the spring and its neighboring hill, a small ridge that plunges down from just underneath Al-Aqsa Mosque today. This ridge is surrounded by valleys on all three sides, making it easily defensible. However, Jerusalem remained vulnerable to its northern side, which has nearly always been the point of access for conquering armies throughout history. From the Babylonians to the Romans to the Crusaders, they all breached Jerusalem's walls from the north. Most scholars believe that the first textual references of Jerusalem comes from Egyptian execration texts, curses against rulers and their cities that were written down on clay figurines or pieces of pottery. The name of Jerusalem and its king, Yakar Amu, is recorded on one of these texts. We can also learn about late Bronze Age Jerusalem from the Amarna tablets, which we discussed in episodes 2 and 3. The Amarna tablets are a huge cache of tablets discovered in Egypt that record diplomatic correspondences between Canaanite kings and the Egyptian pharaohs. One group of them came from the ruler of Jerusalem himself, who was named Abdi-Heba. Altogether, we have 6 such letters from Jerusalem. They show that Jerusalem was a kind of localized city-state under control of the Egyptian Empire. So when we think about the fact that late Bronze Age Jerusalem must have had a centralized administration, a palace, a scribal school, and perhaps a city wall, it's kind of weird to learn that there are very few remains at all from this time period. Although we assume that the city roughly sat in the location of the earlier Middle Bronze Age, its overall character remains one of the biggest archaeological mysteries. So let's fast forward to the Iron Age when the Bible says that King David conquered the city. The story in 2 Samuel chapter 5 is confusing, and part of the text may even be missing. The story may have also been reshaped and redacted as it was handed down before later being set in the biblical canon that we know today. The story goes something like this. According to 2 Samuel, David appears to tell his army that in order to attack the Jebusite inhabitants of Jerusalem, his army needed to get up a water shaft. In the parallel story in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, it's David's commander Joab who attacks the Jebusites first. But there's a problem. Because the Hebrew word that refers to this water shaft is used only twice in the entire Bible, it's not exactly clear how to understand the term. Does it refer to a vertical shaft, a horizontal tunnel, or something else entirely? Now, this hasn't stopped some from suggesting that they know exactly where this water shaft was. Remember the Gihon Spring? Well, there's a complex set of tunnels that come off in almost every direction. Some of them were dug intentionally to bring water to other parts of the city, and others were formed naturally over time by erosion. One of the vertical shafts near the spring was discovered by an early British explorer named Charles Warren. Several decades after Warren found that shaft, a French scholar theorized that this was the very shaft mentioned in 2 Samuel. So by this theory, Joab ascended the shaft and climbed into the city to surprise attack the Jebusites and open the gates for David's army. For almost a century, this theory was nearly universally accepted. And if you go there today, you will hear tour guides repeat the story again and again. However, later studies in the 1980s and the 1990s have shown conclusively that the top of the shaft was not yet exposed during the time of David. Had Joab or David climbed up to the top, they would have hit a dead end. There is another mention of a Jerusalem conquest in Judges by the tribe of Judah. Although it does not mention that the Judahites settled in the city, it does say that they captured it and set it on fire. It's hard to know if this represents only a temporary conquest of the city before it was retaken by the Jebusites, or a completely different literary tradition that explains how it fell into the hands of the Israelites. So, from the text and the archaeology, it's hard to understand how exactly Jerusalem became David's capital. 2 Samuel claims that David built a palace, fortified the city, and purchased the area where the temple would later be built by Solomon. But what can archaeology tell us about David, Solomon, and their building projects? Not much. The true nature of David's kingdom is one of the biggest ongoing debates among scholars. There is at least a broad agreement that David existed as a real person. In 1993, David's name was deciphered on an Aramaic inscription from Tel Dan, a site near the northern border of the modern state of Israel. However, there are no known inscriptions that mention Solomon at all. So what about their building projects in Jerusalem? Well, the topographical setting of Jerusalem broadly fits the biblical description of each project, but few remains from the time of David and Solomon have ever been discovered. And nothing of Solomon's temple or his palace complex has come to light. And because today most of this area falls within a politically sensitive space, the Dome of the Rock Plaza called the Haram al-Sharif, it's unlikely that it will ever be excavated anytime soon. One archaeologist named Eilat Mazar has claimed to find the remains of King David's palace, just above the Gihon Spring, but very few archaeologists agree with her, because she has not been able to convincingly date the building she uncovered to David's time. But just underneath the area that she dug, there is a massive retaining wall that archaeologists call the stepped stone structure. Very creative name, I know. Because the eastern edge of this hill is so steep, ancient builders needed to construct supporting walls in order to build anything large on top. A structure this big must have supported big buildings on the crest of the hill. But archaeologists debate what it could have been. A Canaanite structure? David's palace? Another building altogether? Archaeologically, we really can't say one way or another. Ascertaining the date of the stepstone structure may help to date whatever buildings originally sat on top. But there are a few problems. First, the most recent major excavations of the retaining wall from the 1980s still have not been published. Second, scholars have very different opinions about when the structure was built, with some dating it to the end of the Late Bronze Age, which would make it Canaanite, and others to the early Iron Age and others to the Iron Age II period. Moreover, excavations in this area remain hotly contested, as the area is part of the predominantly Palestinian neighborhood of Silwan. Pushes for new excavations in the area are thus frequently politically motivated and would disrupt the lives of the people living there today. So, scholars will continue to debate how the meager archaeological evidence related to Iron Age Jerusalem correlates to the grand city of David and Solomon described in the Bible. Does the lack of archaeological evidence for early Israelite Jerusalem mean that the Bible is just wrong about the details of David and Solomon's Jerusalem? Or was much of this early evidence destroyed by later building projects? Are we even digging in the right places? Only new data and further research can help us address these questions. Thanks for watching. That was the latest episode of Patheos' new series, Excavating the History of the Bible. Click on the playlist on screen to catch up on the whole series.
With Jerusalem framed, the story turns north to the OmRide Dynasty and King Ahab, seen not only in the Bible, but in Assyrian records. Here's something to note. Assyrian inscriptions like the Kirk monolith list Ahab among the coalition at Karkar. And another fascinating detail, the ivory house tradition points to luxury crafts tied to the OmRide court. Ready to uncover more? Here we go.
King Ahab was a pretty bad guy, at least according to the Bible, famously doing evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. 1 Kings describes Ahab worshipping Canaanite gods like Baal and Asherah, as well as running into conflict with the prophet Elijah. But most notoriously of all, he marries the evil Tyrian princess Jezebel, who ruthlessly persecutes worshippers of Yahweh, purging his prophets from the lands of Israel. But who was Ahab? To answer this question, we're actually going to start with his dad, King Omri, a man who founded the OmRide Dynasty, a line of kings that ruled the northern kingdom of Israel for about 50 years. Omri himself receives little attention in the Bible, other than a short paragraph that he was the 6th king of Israel, that he moved the capital city to Samaria, and that he also sinned more than all those before him. This pretty much summarizes the Bible's view of the Omrides, shining a very unfavorable light on him and his lineage. The Omrides were a line of idol worshippers who angered the Lord, the God of Israel. Ahab, his son, died in battle, shot by an archer, while Jezebel was thrown to her death from the palace window at Jezreel, and her body eaten by dogs. The whole dynasty ends in ruin with the usurper Jehu killing Ahab's son at Jezreel, along with the rest of Ahab's remaining family. While the biblical text tells of the Omrides' evils, it doesn't tell the whole story. Archaeological evidence suggests that the OmRide Dynasty was one of the most powerful political entities in the whole region, reigning over an era of economic prosperity and territorial expansion, and marking a new chapter in the history of Israel. Let's start with Samaria, the new capital founded by King Omri. The site of Samaria, modern Sabastia, is located on a rocky hilltop in the Palestinian territory of the West Bank, around 65 kilometers north of Jerusalem. The Bible tells us that Omri bought the land and named the city he built, Samaria, after the land's previous owner. Excavations here have revealed that the site had been inhabited from the 11th century, but the earliest phase of monumental construction correspond to Omri's reign, dating to the early 9th century. Archaeologists discovered a huge palatial complex that they dubbed the Palace of Omri. It is absolutely massive, with foundations measuring approximately 55 by 40 meters. This palace is the largest monumental construction dating to the Iron Age in the Levant. Situated on the top of a hill, the location provided both a good vantage point of the plains below, as well as allowing for the palace to be visible for some distance, which must have advertised the OmRide's strength. We also can see hints of their wealth and engineering skill. The walls were constructed using a technique called ashlar masonry, in which stones are cut into uniform shapes, then laid in horizontal layers. The blocks of stone used for the construction for the Palace of Omri were fit together so well that no mortar was needed. A bunch of ivory decorations were also discovered during the early excavations of the site, which may have been used to decorate furniture. Kathleen Kenyon, one of the site's principal excavators in the early 1930s, identified these ivories as belonging to the so-called ivory house that the Bible says Ahab built. But reanalysis of both the site and Kenyon's excavation reports have called this into question. It's more likely that the ivories came from later layers, perhaps during the reign of King Jeroboam II. The founding of the Israelite capital at Samaria was a watershed moment for the Kingdom of Israel. Before, there were few settlements in the region. Those that did exist were small and scattered across the territory. But after its founding, the archaeological record reveals an expansion of villages, as well as the development of a road system connecting the highlands in Samaria with the coast. This road system connected the Samarian highlands to lucrative trade routes, which helped the economy of the northern kingdom of Israel to flourish. The OmRide kings were also apparently a regional military power. Let's return to the city of Megiddo as an example. As we talked about in episode 2, Megiddo was formerly a crowning jewel for the Canaanites. But now, a few hundred years later, it was a crowning jewel of the OmRide Dynasty. 2 palaces at Megiddo have been attributed to the OmRides, as well as some pretty impressive fortifications. The emphasis on defensive fortifications at nearly every OmRide site hints that they were ruling during pretty violent times. Check out this inscription. It's known as the Mesha Stele, named after the king of Moab mentioned in the inscription. It says Omri was the king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab for many days. And his son succeeded him, and he said, I too will oppress Moab. So Mesha describes a military conflict between Moab and a dynasty of Israelite kings led by Omri, and later his son, possibly Ahab. So we can surmise that Omri and his son not only led successful military campaigns in nearby Moab, but managed to occupy the territory for 40 years. There also is evidence for skirmishes between the Omrides and the Arameans to the north, based in Damascus. An inscription found at Tel Dan records the death of 2 Omride kings at the hands of the king of Damascus. In the text, the Aramean king states that the king of Israel entered previously in my father's land. Now, we're not sure exactly which king he's talking about, but it's clear that an Israelite king did attempt to infringe upon territory under Damascus control. A quick glance back at the locations of the Omride settlements reveals that, outside of Samaria, they are predominantly located on the borders of their territory, likely serving as points of military control. The Omrides also apparently fielded an impressive chariot force. An Akkadian inscription from the reign of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III describes a battle fought at the city of Karkar between the invading Assyrian army and an alliance of smaller kingdoms, including King Ahab. The inscription says that Ahab committed 10,000 soldiers and 2,000 chariots to the battle, one of the largest forces mentioned in the inscription. From this evidence, archaeologists surmise that the Omrides must have fielded one of the largest standing armies in the whole region. So, how were the Omride kings able to expand their territories to such a degree, field such big armies, and sponsor such large-scale monumental constructions? Several factors likely contributed to these undertakings. First, their relatively big population, and second, their economy. Let's start with their population. Archaeological surveys have revealed that Omri and Ahab's kingdom was densely populated. Estimates place the population of the northern kingdom of Israel to around 350,000 people, 3 times bigger than the southern kingdom of Judah at the time. Such a large population allowed the Omrides to conscript a large workforce without messing with their agricultural output of olive oil and wine production, which was the backbone of the northern kingdom's economy. Olive oil presses dating to the OmRide Dynasty have been found all over the place, and an extensive complex of wine presses have been excavated at Jezreel. Some argue that the kingdom of Israel was actually one of the major suppliers of olive oil to nearby Egypt and the Assyrian Empire, both of which lacked the conditions necessary for large-scale olive orchards. Another important source of revenue for the northern kingdom must have been horses. As discussed earlier, the Omrides must have fielded an impressive chariot force, which implies that horse breeding was a part of their economy as well. In the 8th century, well after Omride rule, Israel was the main supplier of Egyptian horses to the Assyrian kingdom to the north, which suggests that under the Omrides, the breeding and rearing of war horses was already underway. Some scholars have suggested that Jezreel served as a breeding and training facility for these horses, and at Megiddo, archaeologists have discovered buildings that may have been stables. Although they were originally and erroneously attributed to King Solomon, later studies found that they actually date to the reign of the Omrides. The OmRide Dynasty lasted for less than 50 years, and yet in many ways it marked a turning point for the Kingdom of Israel. During this period, Israel established itself as a major military and economic power, extended its territory into neighboring lands like Moab. The might of the Omride kings is reflected in their numerous monumental constructions located throughout their region, as well as inscriptions from their neighbors. However, this golden age of the northern kingdom was not to last. A little over a century after the death of the last Omride king, political stability in Israel collapsed, and the lands that once belonged to the northern kingdom fell into the hands of the Assyrians. This left its neighbor to the south, the kingdom of Judah, to face off against the Assyrian Empire all by itself. Stay tuned for what happens next. King Hezekiah of Judah versus the Assyrian king Sennacherib is next.
From Ahab's alliances and ivory palaces, we turn to a moment of crisis. Judah bracing for Assyria's relentless advance. Walls rise, water tunnels snake beneath the city, and imperial annals record a clash that echoes through Lachish and Jerusalem. Quick fact before we continue. The Lachish reliefs in Nineveh depict Assyria's siege in vivid detail. And here's another. Hezekiah's tunnel redirected water inside Jerusalem's walls for defense. Time to dig deeper.
This is the so-called Taylor Prism. It is one of 3 known copies of an inscription recounting a campaign waged by the Neo-Assyrian king Sennacherib against the kingdom of Judah in 701 BCE. Things did not end well for the kingdom of Judah. It reads, "As for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities. I took as plunder 200,150 people. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem." The Hebrew Bible remembers Hezekiah as one of the good kings of Judah. He destroyed pagan cultic centers and did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. 2 Kings 18:5 says that there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah after him, or among those who were before him. So, how did we get from Hezekiah, the unrivaled godly king of Judah, to Hezekiah, the caged bird, the defeated vassal to a regional superpower? To answer that, we need to dig into the archaeology of one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of Judah, the invasion of Sennacherib. First, some background of what scholars call the Neo-Assyrian Empire. After a period of decline, the Neo-Assyrian Empire went through a resurgence in the 8th century, when the king Tiglath-Pileser III, also called TP3, came to power. He began an internal restructuring of the empire that enabled the Assyrians to start expanding their territory once again, eventually conquering the little kingdoms in the Levant. In practice, the Assyrians appear to have instituted several types of rule. Sometimes they instituted provinces directly controlled by the Assyrian governors, but other times they allowed vassal states to be ruled by one of the locals, as long as they paid annual tribute. If the local population and local ruler were obedient, then the Assyrians were perfectly content to intervene as little as possible. But woe to you if you rebelled. The Assyrians also had official policies of forced deportations of conquered people and a reign by terror policy. The Assyrians were famous for gruesome displays of brutality against conquered people, including flaying, beheading, and sticking people on pikes. This is basically what happened to Judah's neighbor to the north, the northern kingdom of Israel. As a vassal state to the Assyrians, the northern kingdom of Israel was left in peace during the reign of Menahem, who loyally paid tribute. But after a series of kings refused to pay, the Assyrians retaliated, ultimately resulting in Shalmaneser V besieging the capital city of Samaria and overthrowing it. The Assyrians subsequently deported large numbers of local Israelites, replacing them with people from other parts of the empire. Many refugees must have fled south to Judah. And here we return to Sennacherib's campaign that caged Hezekiah like a bird in Jerusalem. How did it happen? Well, it was triggered by a similar decision made by the northern kingdom of Israel, refusing to pay tribute. By the time Sennacherib came to power, Judah had also already served as a vassal to Assyria since the reign of King Ahaz, Hezekiah's dad. But Hezekiah wanted to end that. Following the death of Sennacherib's father, Sargon II, Hezekiah stopped paying tribute beginning in 705 BCE. He seemed to be riding a wave of anti-Assyrian sentiment throughout the region, supported by Egypt and internal rivals in Sennacherib's empire. Sennacherib was ultimately forced to march on Judah in 701 BCE. Both the accounts in 2 Kings and the Sennacherib prisms report that Sennacherib conquered Judah's fortified cities, and the archaeological record seems to corroborate this. Let's focus on the city of Lachish as an example. Located south of Jerusalem, Lachish was, for centuries, a major Canaanite city, and later one of the major cities in the kingdom of Judah, second only in importance to Jerusalem. It was an administrative center and apparently a military hub as well. It was heavily fortified with a massive wall and an impressive 6-chambered gate. But this was not enough to save the city from Sennacherib. He marched against Lachish and utterly destroyed it. Evidence of this attack was left for archaeologists to discover thousands of years later. Sling stones and hundreds of arrowheads were discovered at the city wall. A mass grave of over 1,000 people, men, women, and children, was discovered nearby, as well as a siege ramp built by the Assyrians leading up to the city walls. Sennacherib and his army successfully battered through the wall. He must have been particularly proud of his victory because he memorialized the battle in a huge relief sculpture displayed on the walls of one of the rooms in his palace in Nineveh. 60 feet long and 9 feet high, this sculpture portrays in grim detail Sennacherib's victory at Lachish, giving us an unparalleled glimpse into the horrors of ancient Near Eastern warfare and the tactics of the Assyrian army, including their military technology. We see siege machines, almost like an ancient battle tank, being pushed up toward the walls of Lachish, perhaps depicting the very same siege ramp found at Tel Lachish today. Flaming torches fall around as the Judahites attempt to set the battering ram on fire. Assyrian archers aim their arrows upward against the defenders. Assyrian soldiers are depicted plunging a dagger into Judahite prisoners, while Sennacherib sits enthroned before the defeated army. Of course, this is all being filtered through the lens of Assyrian sculptors, employed by Sennacherib himself. This sculpture is, first and foremost, imperial propaganda, but there is no doubt it at least provides a glimpse into what went down at Lachish, the full-scale destruction and looting of the city. Sennacherib then turned his attention to Jerusalem, Hezekiah's royal city. With the threat of this level of destruction, there is some evidence that Hezekiah may have prepared the capital city for battle against the Assyrians. First, the construction of a large defensive wall known as the Broad Wall, and secondly, the construction of a tunnel that brought water from the Gihon Spring into the walls of Jerusalem, though there is some debate whether or not it was Hezekiah who instituted these building projects. The Broad Wall can still be seen in the old city of Jerusalem today, and it's absolutely massive, 7 meters wide and built directly through domestic sites, possibly evidence it was built in a time of emergency, with construction workers just building straight through some people's houses. What about the tunnel? The Siloam Tunnel, also known as Hezekiah's Tunnel, stretches 533 meters hewn out of solid rock. It zigzags at crazy angles from the Gihon Spring to the Siloam Pool at the southern end of the city of David. Remember from episode 5 that the Gihon Spring is the only regular source of water for Jerusalem, and may have been the very reason why the earliest inhabitants of the city, thousands of years ago, started a city there in the first place. This tunnel allowed for the inhabitants of Jerusalem to stay inside the city walls to gather water during a siege, while keeping attackers from having an easy access to the water themselves. An inscription discovered inside the tunnel documents the moment when the workers digging the tunnel met. The inscription reads, "And this is the story of the tunnel. While the axes were against each other, and while 3 cubits were left to cut, the voice of a man called to his counterpart. And on the day of the tunnel being finished, the stonecutters struck each man toward his counterpart, axe against axe, and water flowed from the source to the pool for 1,200 cubits." Based on this inscription, 2 groups of workers apparently started at different ends, working towards one another until they met in the middle. The Hebrew Bible mentions Hezekiah building waterworks on several occasions. For example, 2 Kings 20:20 says Hezekiah made the pool and the tunnel by which he brought water into the city. 2 Chronicles provides an even more expansive account, saying that when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and that he intended to wage war against Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and military staff about blocking off the water from the springs outside. Although many scholars agree that this inscription and tunnel date to the reign of Hezekiah, there's not an absolute consensus. Some scholars argue that it could have taken up to 4 years to complete it, and therefore was not something that could have been constructed urgently in advance of an Assyrian invasion. See, the tunnel was cut through some excessively hard dolomite. Modern engineers theorize that ancient masons could have cut a 1.4 meter square tunnel at a rate of 0.35 meters per day. That's assuming that only one worker can fit in the tunnel at a time, cutting stone in 4-hour shifts 6 days a week. Also building in some time to swap out rock cutters as they get tired. Based on this hypothetical scenario, the longest segment of the tunnel, about 300 meters, would have taken 857 workdays. In any case, not the sort of project that could have been accomplished quickly with little lead time. Because of this, some theorize that Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, built this tunnel instead, while others maintain it was Hezekiah himself. So, how did this invasion end? According to the biblical account, the Assyrians are ultimately defeated thanks to the intervention of Yahweh. Isaiah chapter 37 states that an angel of God struck down 185,000 Assyrian troops in a single night, prompting Sennacherib to depart from the region and return to Mesopotamia. Although we should not expect the Assyrians to record such a massive loss for their own propagandistic aims, there's good reason to believe that the Assyrians departed simply because Hezekiah agreed to start paying tribute yet again. As far as we can tell from the archaeological record, the Assyrians achieved total victory. The region around Lachish was depopulated and seems to have never fully recovered. The majority of the kingdom of Judah was left in ruins. Only Jerusalem and its immediate surroundings were spared. Hezekiah was again forced to pay a heavy tribute to the Assyrians, and the kingdom of Judah limped along as a vassal to Assyria. Ultimately, this campaign is a pivotal moment within the history of Judah and the Hebrew Bible. The Bible portrays King Hezekiah as a hero, standing up against the mighty Assyrians. This perspective hinges mostly on the biblical perception that Hezekiah was a devoutly religious king. The Bible recounts Hezekiah's efforts to centralize the worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem, while also destroying the religious sites of competing gods. Hezekiah's defiance against the Assyrians is also characterized as a religious act, with 2 Kings 18 and 19 and Isaiah 31 noting that Hezekiah relied on God to save Judah from Assyrian might. While the Hebrew Bible does acknowledge that Sennacherib campaigned throughout Judah, it emphasizes that Jerusalem is saved through the actions of Hezekiah and his reliance on Yahweh. But as we see in the archaeology around Lachish and the Sennacherib prisms, the events at the end of the 8th century BCE were so catastrophic that Hezekiah remained loyal to the Assyrians for the remainder of his reign. His son and successor Manasseh enjoyed a reign of peace and relative prosperity under their shadow as the Neo-Assyrian Empire reached the height of its power in 640 BCE, expanding into Egypt. Ultimately, this set the stage for the end of the Kingdom of Judah. Assyrian territorial expansion proved to be the downfall of their empire, as they were spread way too thin. The Babylonians consolidated power and marched against the Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 612 BCE and took the city. By 610, the Neo-Assyrians no longer existed, leaving the region to the control of the Babylonians, which set the stage for one of the most significant events in the Hebrew Bible: the Babylonian destruction of the temple and the exile of many of the Judahite elites. Hey everyone, that was the latest episode in Patheos' new series on the Bible and archaeology. Click on the links on screen to watch the most recent episode or to watch the whole series.
After siege and survival, the spotlight shifts to reform. King Josiah steps onto the stage with sweeping changes, text rediscovered, altars dismantled, and a kingdom reshaped by covenant and conviction. Here's something interesting. A book of the law becomes central to Josiah's program of reform. And another insight: Josiah's reign coincides with major geopolitical shifts in the Near East. Let's jump into the next chapter.
How did the ancient Israelites come to worship a single God? And why was that God worshipped in the city of Jerusalem? The life of a particular child king may hold the answer: King Josiah. The biblical authors remember Josiah as the leader of a massive religious reform that changed the course of Judah's history and led to a new dominant form of monotheistic religion centralized in Jerusalem. According to 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, Josiah came to the throne at the age of 8 after 2 generations of evil and apostasy. Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, rebuilt cultic sites to gods other than Yahweh, even building additional altars in the Jerusalem temple for sacrifices to other gods. King Amon, Josiah's father, continued this practice. But Josiah brought this to an end. The biblical authors portray Josiah as a devout worshiper of Israel's God, Yahweh, and one who exemplified the most noble characteristics of King David. But, unlike King David, Josiah ruled during a time when a temple for Yahweh stood in Jerusalem. The temple, just like any other royal building project, required periodic renovation. So, while inventorying the temple's treasury, the high priest found a book that 2 Kings calls the Book of the Law. Scholars have long assumed that this was an early form of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. When the king's chief advisor read the book aloud to Josiah, the king tore his garments in grief. Josiah was convinced that Judah had strayed from the laws of Yahweh and had kindled his wrath against the kingdom. Josiah then assembled the people at the temple, where he read aloud to them the book of the law and made a covenant with Yahweh to uphold his commandments. The words of this covenant echo the language of Deuteronomy, in which Israel is counseled by Moses to love Yahweh with all their hearts, souls, and strength. Josiah then launched a major religious reformation, starting with the temple itself. He commanded the high priest to remove all non-Yahwistic elements from the temple. Items devoted to the gods Baal and Asherah were brought out and burned, and he deposed any priest who offered sacrifices to gods and anyone else who had participated in illicit worship. Beyond the city of Jerusalem, the Bible says that Josiah destroyed cultic sites in Bethel, Samaria, and other parts of the land, while commanding that apostate priests be executed on the spot. In both accounts, the process of purging the land concludes with Josiah's return to Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant was reinstalled in its rightful location within the temple, and Josiah decreed that all the people would keep the Passover festival. Although Josiah's ancestor Hezekiah is said to have led religious reforms as well, the Bible describes Josiah's campaign to reorient the people of Judah to Yahweh as both grander in scale and deeper in impact. But to what extent do we see the reforms in the archaeological record? Well, most scholars accept the idea that Josiah enacted some kind of religious reform, but the archaeological record remains silent on most of the particulars. Let's start with all of those cultic sites outside of Jerusalem. The Bible says that Josiah destroyed illicit worship sites throughout the lands of Judah and Israel, specifically mentioning Beersheba, Bethel, and Samaria as locations where Josiah dismantled altars, executed priests, and burned cultic paraphernalia. While we don't see evidence of this purge in the archaeological record, it's clear that the religious lives of most people in ancient Israel and Judah were not centered around the Jerusalem temple. Before Josiah took the throne, there were major cultic sites throughout the land. These sites consisted of open-air sanctuaries, altars, and standing stones called masebot, which were often situated in high places. These stones may have represented several individual gods, which, in the eyes of Josiah, would be a form of idolatry and polytheism. Tel Dan was home to one of the most important cultic sites dating to the Iron Age, which consisted of an open-air shrine with a four-horned altar, as well as a separate open-air section for standing stones next to the city gate. There's also some evidence from Beersheba of religious activity too, but these sites do not provide direct evidence of Josiah's reforms. Tel Dan was not part of Josiah's kingdom, and the evidence from Beersheba does not appear to line up with the time frame when Josiah ruled. But these sites do demonstrate that Israelite religion, for much of its history, was not only decentralized, but could also include the worship of multiple gods. The people apparently worshipped Yahweh along with other gods like El, Baal, and Asherah for centuries. This complex religious history makes drawing the lines of an official Israelite religion pretty difficult. Prior to the 20th century, one of the main assumptions of biblical scholars was that the Canaanites and Israelites were distinct peoples, both ethnically and culturally. Israelite religion was therefore portrayed as unique from Canaanite religious practice. But archaeological excavations over the last century continue to produce evidence showing that such distinctions are not so clear-cut. Household worship throughout the region apparently incorporated representations of other gods and established local sites for cult practice. As mentioned in previous episodes, assemblages of human and animal figurines, such as Judean pillar figurines, have been found at Iron Age sites throughout Israel and Judah. This evidence shows us that the cultic practice of the Israelite people clearly did not match up with Josiah's ideals, which might have been part of the motivation for his sweeping reforms. The reforms Josiah and the small group of elites in Jerusalem who supported him would have thus been quite shocking to the majority of the population, because both the archaeological record and the biblical texts depict a significant amount of religious diversity in Israel and Judah. Although Deuteronomy and Kings consistently claim that Israel brought their Yahweh-only religion with them upon entering the land, the Merneptah Stele implicitly suggests that Israel's religious allegiance was not initially to Yahweh alone, nor even to Yahweh at all, but to the Canaanite god El, a reality visible in the name itself, Israel. But even Yahweh-exclusive religion should not be called monotheism. Ancient Israelite religion, based on evidence found both in the Hebrew Bible as well in the archaeological record, can better be defined as monolatrous. Monolatry means the recognition of the existence of many gods, but with the consistent worship of only one God. When we read verses like Micah 4:5, "For all the peoples walk each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God," we should take the prophet at his word. They believed that many gods exist, but Israel worships Yahweh exclusively. Strict monotheism, if it ever truly existed as the status quo, was a later development. Scholars have argued we don't see clear denial of the existence of other gods until quite late in the Hebrew Bible, maybe around the 6th century BCE in sections of the book of Isaiah. Remains from two sites located on the edge of the Judean wilderness, Arad and Ein Hatzavah, might provide limited insight into religious reforms in the Kingdom of Judah. Tel Arad is a fort located on the southern frontier of the Kingdom of Judah, on the fringe of the Negev desert. Inside the fort, archaeologists discovered a religious sanctuary, sometimes described as a shrine or a temple. It had an outer courtyard with an altar, as well as an inner Holy of Holies, where archaeologists discovered a standing stone and two limestone altars, one taller than the other. Some reconstruct that the sanctuary originally had two standing stones. Now, remember that standing stones may be a non-anthropomorphic way to represent a god, so some scholars have interpreted this as an expression of Judahite religion involving Yahweh and a consort goddess, which, referring back to the previous discussion, demonstrates the monolatrous nature of ancient Israelite religion. Residue analysis of the larger altar revealed traces of frankincense, while the smaller altar revealed traces of cannabis, which, according to the researchers of the study, may be the first known evidence of a hallucinogenic substance found in the Kingdom of Judah. So what does this site have to do with religious reforms? Well, there's some evidence that someone intentionally dismantled the Tel Arad sanctuary. The incense altars and the standing stone were discovered placed on their sides and covered with dirt and plaster. Some of the walls were dismantled, and the whole area and the altar and the courtyard were covered by 3 meters of dirt. However, it's unlikely that these activities can be attributed to King Josiah. The whole sanctuary apparently was dismantled in the 8th century, well before Josiah's reign. Some archaeologists thus suggest that this might be evidence for religious reforms under King Hezekiah instead. Further southeast at Ein Hatzavah, archaeologists have uncovered an assemblage of smashed cultic pottery vessels that appear to have been intentionally shattered. But overall, evidence to demonstrate that these items were destroyed at the command of King Josiah is lacking. What is known is that Judean royal seals changed in the 7th century, following the period of Josiah's rule. In the preceding era, these markers of royal property and official correspondence bore images and symbols associated with the types of cultic practice that Josiah sought to destroy. By the late 7th century, the majority of seals lacked such iconography, which might indicate that Josiah's reforms succeeded on some level. Josiah is remembered by the biblical authors as a king who had no parallel, either before or after his reign. Josiah's intentions for religious reforms aligned with the hopes of the biblical authors that scholars today call Deuteronomists, a group who sought to limit local religious differences and encourage a centralized form of Yahwism based in Jerusalem. With such acts of centralization, the theologies and cultic practice outside of Jerusalem were subsumed by a more dominant royal theology and religious practice. Through the cross-examination of textual and archaeological evidence, we can see that biblical texts by and large enunciate a specifically Judahite Yahwism that matured right before, during, and after the Babylonian exile. But despite going down in history as one of the greatest kings of Judah, he met an untimely death. The young Josiah inherited a kingdom during a period of Neo-Assyrian decline. A century before, the Assyrian Empire destroyed Judah's northern neighbor, Israel, and later destroyed many of Judah's fortified cities under King Hezekiah. While Judah regained some level of economic and political stability after this, during Josiah's reign, Judah found itself in the familiar position of being sandwiched between warring superpowers. In 609 BCE, the Egyptians and Assyrians engaged in battle together against the advancing Babylonian armies north of Judah. Although much remains unknown about this fight, it appears that the Assyrians were trying to protect their western territories. The biblical sources indicate that Josiah rode north from Judah and that upon meeting the Pharaoh at Megiddo, he was killed. But the Bible details the last moments of Josiah's life and indicates that his body was returned to Jerusalem for burial. Josiah's untimely demise resonates in some ways with his unexpected rise to power at such a young age, and likely contributed to the memory of this child king as a great reformer and proponent of Yahwism. But despite Josiah's reforms, less than a century after these events, Jerusalem would fall to the Babylonian armies of Nebuchadnezzar, the punishment for the people for their apostasy. Stay tuned for the next episode, The Fall of Jerusalem.
From Josiah's reforms to Babylon's fury, the story darkens. Ash layers and shattered walls mark the fall of Jerusalem, as Nebuchadnezzar's armies redraw the map and exile becomes Judah's new reality. Before we move on, here's a fact. Burn layers help archaeologists pin destruction events to specific dates. And another, Babylonian chronicles confirm the fall of Jerusalem in Nebuchadnezzar's campaign. All right, onward to the next story.
"586 BC, the year that the kingdom of Judah fell." How did we get here? During the 8th century, the kingdom of Judah had shown itself to be a good and loyal vassal to Assyria. They were doing what they were told, recognizing Assyria's superiority and paying any tribute. The northern kingdom of Israel, on the other hand, had just tried and failed to rebel against Assyria in 720 BC. 20 years later, King Hezekiah of Judah then tried his own rebellion against Assyria and failed. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, retaliated, wiping out most of the kingdom of Judah. All the major cities and some smaller ones were destroyed. Basically, only Jerusalem was left. The lesson the Assyrians wanted the Israelites to learn was, pay your imperial taxes and tributes, or else. The next few decades were relatively quiet. Hezekiah's son Manasseh took over and ruled for 55 years. While the books of 1st and 2nd Kings give him a bad reputation, claiming he committed all manner of religious sins against God, what the Bible does not mention is that he rebuilt Judah, in large part thanks to being a loyal Assyrian vassal, paying his taxes and tributes. Same with his son Amon and his grandson Josiah. However, problems at home caused the Assyrians to withdraw and focus on a new threat: Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian Empire toppled Assyria and became the new superpower on the block. But the kingdom of Judah did not learn their lessons from the 8th century. Like Hezekiah before him, Zedekiah, the current king of Judah, failed to pay tribute to the new superpower, prompting the Babylonians to invade Judah in 586. But this time the kingdom did not survive. The Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple of Yahweh. They killed Zedekiah's sons, took Zedekiah off into exile, and deported a huge chunk of the population. This was the end of the kingdom of Judah. 2 Kings 25 describes in grim detail how the Babylonian captain of the guard destroyed the city. "And he burned the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down." So what archaeological evidence is there for this attack? Well, as 2 Kings 25 suggests, the main evidence in Jerusalem are houses, specifically houses of the wealthy elite of Jerusalem. During excavations in the city of David, 3 Iron Age structures were uncovered: the house of Ahiel, the house of the Bulai, and the burnt room. All the buildings were covered by the collapsed debris of the upper stories, and all had fallen charred beams, suggesting that they burned in a city-wide fire. Archaeologists also found arrowheads throughout the city dating to the Babylonian attack. Not only do we see this evidence for the dire situation in 586 BC, but we also found loads of everyday household items too, such as figurines, jewelry, and pottery vessels. The first structure is the house of Ahiel. Inscribed pottery was found inside the house with the name Ahiel, leading to this name for the house. Ahiel's house is one of the best preserved Iron Age structures. It even has an external stone staircase leading up to a second story that no longer exists. One of the most significant parts of this excavation was the toilet. Yes, you're now looking at an ancient toilet which was discovered still situated over a deep cesspit beneath it, filled with ancient human feces. The stone toilet and cesspit show a level of sophistication in the hygiene practices within the city, but the remains in the cesspit may also shed light on the diet of the ancient Judahites and point to the difficulties during the siege. Analysis of the fecal remains revealed organic matter, including human parasite eggs, fish bones, and most interestingly, barely edible plants that suggest people were subsisting on weeds foraged from around the city. The pollen grains identified come from 4 plant families: mustard, carrot, mint, and daisy. These likely originated from uncultivated salad greens and spices, but what is notably lacking are cultivated plants typically found in diets like wheat and barley. This might indicate how desperate the situation was for them during the Babylonian attack. They were barely surviving and forced to eat whatever they could find around the city. The second site is the so-called burnt room. It also bears the hallmarks of destruction. Archaeologists discovered a layer full of charred remains, including carved wooden furniture and a small ivory statue of a woman in an Egyptian-style wig. The craftsmanship is very high quality and suggests that the members of this household were rich enough to afford luxury items like furniture and ivory statues. Next is the House of the Bulli. Only a small part of the House of the Bulli was uncovered underneath a thick layer of burnt debris. However, archaeologists found within the remains iron arrowheads as well as pottery vessels, stone weights, and most notably, a collection of more than 50 fingernail-sized clay ceilings called bulli. Bulli are small clay discs that were impressed with a stamp to mark an official document. These were used as proof of a document's authenticity in a bureaucratic system. In this case, the bulli were preserved when the house burned down, burning up the documents but leaving the stamps behind for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. One in particular mentions a guy named Gamaliel, son of Shaphan, a high official at the court of King Jehoiakim of Judah, who reigned during the first attack on Judah from Babylon. So from the evidence in the House of Ahiel, the House of the Bulli, and the Burnt Room, we get a picture of the wholesale destruction of Jerusalem, and the devastation even of the upper-class houses. But what happened next? According to the Bible, the Babylonians killed Zedekiah's descendants and took the king and more of the elites into exile as hostages. They left other non-elite people behind in Judah to fend for themselves. So part of the population was stuck in the ruined Judah, and the other part was taken back to Babylon, where they were mostly forced to settle all over the empire with other refugees. Those who were forced into exile lost everything: their homeland, family members, and were taken to a land they had never been to and did not speak the language. This event, called the Babylonian exile or Babylonian captivity, had a significant impact on Judahite identity. Big theological questions arose from this catastrophe. Had God abandoned his promises? Was God in control? Were the Babylonian gods more powerful? Basically, where was God and why had this happened? Books in the Hebrew Bible like Lamentations and Jeremiah wrestled with these questions. There's some archaeological evidence for these communities of Judean people who now lived in a foreign land under foreign rulers. This is an example from the so-called Al-Yahudu tablets, a collection of 200 tablets from a Judean community in Babylon called the Al-Yahudu community. These documents show that, basically, the exiled people were getting on with their lives. They were trading with the locals, dealing with legal cases with the locals, and paying taxes just like the locals. Back home, the former kingdom of Judah was now a Babylonian province called by the Aramaic name Yehud, and was firmly under imperial rule. Nothing much would have happened here without Babylonian approval. We don't know much about the archaeology of Yehud, but it seems that Jerusalem remained in ruins, had minimal habitation, and the temple was not rebuilt. So life was not great in Yehud, though it was continuing. Tune in next time to learn what happens next to the people of Judah. Hey everyone, that was the latest episode in Patheos' series, Excavating the History of the Bible. Click on the playlist on screen to catch up on the whole series.
Intermission. Excavating the History of the Bible will resume shortly. Please enjoy part 2 of Patheos' Excavating the History of the Bible. Welcome to our part 2 live stream marathon of one of Patheos' most popular series, Excavating the History of the Bible. Tonight, we're continuing our look back at the episodes that dig deep into archaeology and the biblical world. Pot shards, inscriptions, and city walls that bring ancient stories into sharper focus. Settle in for a binge-worthy journey through the landscapes, artifacts, and people who shaped the Bible's history. Let's continue with episode 10, The Surprising Origins of Hebrew.
This is the latest episode in my series, Excavating the History of the Bible, brought to you by Patheos.com. Click on the playlist below to watch all previous episodes. The Hebrew Bible is written mostly in Hebrew, no surprises there. But where did the Hebrew language come from? The earliest evidence we have for ancient Israelite language actually comes not from the Hebrew Bible, but from the archaeological record. What you're looking at is an inscription on a broken piece of pottery discovered in a storage pit in the ancient Israelite town of Isbet-Sarta. It might date as early as the 12th century BCE. Here at the bottom of the inscription is a Proto-Canaanite alphabet. Although technically written in a Canaanite language, scholars notice that we might be looking at a missing link between Canaanite and later Hebrew. The Isbet-Sarta inscription demonstrates the first known example of the letter order that we see in the Hebrew alphabet, and later the Greek alphabet. Scholars call inscriptions like this abecedaries. Abecedaries are objects on which a scribe simply wrote down the entire alphabet, probably early in their schooling career, just like how we learn the alphabet today. The Isbet-Sarta abecedary is particularly messy too, which leads some scholars to believe that it was a practice tablet used by students learning how to write. This one object raises several topics that we'll explore in this episode. First of all, this tells us that by the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, an alphabet within the Canaanite language family was being used and taught in scribal schools. Secondly, we see evidence of an alphabetic system used in an early ancestor of Hebrew that differed from other systems of writing used elsewhere in the ancient Near East, like cuneiform and hieroglyphics. Unlike cuneiform, which was a system of signs that stood for syllables and entire words, this was an alphabet using individual letters, a new linguistic invention that changed the way that people wrote and spelled, with each symbol representing a sound, just like how we write and spell today using the Latin alphabet. Let's start with a basic overview. Hebrew belongs to a broader family of languages known as the Semitic language family. Today that includes modern Hebrew, Arabic, and the Ethiopian language Ge'ez. But the earliest Semitic language that we know is called Akkadian, and was spoken and written by the people of Mesopotamia, such as the Neo-Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians, both who had a huge historical impact on ancient Israel. Akkadian is part of a branch of Semitic languages called East Semitic, and was written in cuneiform, which you can see here on screen. It's a wedge-shaped form of writing which was inherited from the Sumerians. Hebrew, on the other hand, belongs to the Northwest Semitic branch. The earliest language we have from this branch is called Ugaritic, and was spoken and written by the inhabitants of Ugarit on the coast of late Bronze Age Syria. Other Northwest Semitic languages included Aramaic, Phoenician, Moabite, and a bunch of lesser-known Canaanite languages that may have been mutually intelligible. You can probably tell by all of this that this region, the Levant, was a melting pot of closely related languages. People in this region were speaking a bunch of Northwest Semitic languages, as well as languages like Akkadian and Egyptian. At the very least, scribes knew multiple languages, including the lingua franca of the late Bronze Age, Akkadian, and the lingua franca of the Iron Age, Aramaic. We surmise this based on archaeological evidence, such as the Amarna letters. As we discussed in episodes 2 and 3 of the series, the Amarna letters are a cache of tablets mostly consisting of diplomatic correspondences between Canaanite kings and the Egyptian pharaoh. And most of these letters were written in Akkadian, not Canaanite. Much of our evidence regarding languages in the ancient Near East are texts which were produced by professional scribes. These scribes would have been trained in scribal schools and served important roles within society based on their education. The tradition of professional scribes and scribal schools dates back to the Sumerians in ancient Mesopotamia and the early periods of Egypt, where scribes performed an important role in documenting economic transactions, recording political issues, writing letters, and composing literature. If the Isbet-Sarta Abecedary is indeed a practice tablet, we're seeing evidence of some sort of schooling in early Israelite villages using a Proto-Canaanite dialect. Dating to around the 12th century, the Isbet-Sarta inscription is also one of our earliest pieces of evidence for early stage Hebrew, but most of our written evidence is later, dating to the Iron Age from around 1000 to 587 BC. The majority of this evidence appears on broken pottery with writing on them. For example, in 2008, excavators uncovered a piece of pottery inscribed with 5 lines of Proto-Canaanite script at the site of Khirbet Qeiyafa, a small fortified site located 27 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem. At the time of publishing this video, this is the longest known Proto-Canaanite inscription. It can be confidently dated to the 10th century BC, a few centuries after the Isbet-Sarta inscription, and roughly the time of King David's rule according to the Hebrew Bible. But much of it remains a mystery. Some scholars have proposed very different translations, but several factors complicate these efforts, including the fact that the inscription is heavily damaged and many of the letters have unusual shapes. Despite these difficulties, many scholars propose that this inscription, like the Isbet-Sarta Abecedary, is an example of early stage Hebrew. But remember, both of these inscriptions are technically Proto-Canaanite. Scholars are much more comfortable differentiating Hebrew as a separate language in later centuries. Objects from the later periods of the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judah are inscribed with what scholars sometimes call Paleo-Hebrew. Most of these inscriptions are economic documents. For example, archaeologists discovered a hoard of pottery from the northern kingdom's capital of Samaria, bearing Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions that record the movement of commodities like olive oil and wine to the capital, maybe evidence of taxation or tribute. Other major Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions include the Siloam Tunnel inscription mentioned in an earlier episode. It documents the moment that laborers broke through and completed the tunnel that brought the waters of the Gihon Spring into the city of Jerusalem. So what does all of this evidence tell us about literacy rates in the ancient Israelite kingdoms? Literacy probably existed on a spectrum. So while non-elites may not have been able to read narrative texts, they possibly could have read simple economic documents. But recent evidence suggests literacy rates may have been higher during the Kingdom of Judah than previously thought. Inside a small Judahite fort at Tel Arad on the northern edge of the Negev desert, archaeologists discovered over 100 Hebrew inscriptions. These inscriptions record military administrative matters, like the movement of supplies between military posts. In 2020, when researchers ran these inscriptions through a handwriting analysis algorithm, they determined that they were written by a minimum of 12 different authors, between 4 to 7 of them stationed at Tel Arad alone. Since a tiny fort like Arad couldn't have supported any more than 20 or 30 soldiers, this suggests a surprisingly high rate of literacy within the Judahite military. But where did the Hebrew alphabet come from? Nowadays, when most people think of Hebrew, they picture the classic boxy style of Hebrew letters, which is commonly used in modern Hebrew today, as well as in editions of the Hebrew Bible. However, the earliest ancestors of Hebrew and other Northwest Semitic languages did not use this same script. This earliest alphabet is known as the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet because it was discovered on the Sinai Peninsula at an ancient Egyptian mining camp called Serebit el-Kadim. There, archaeologists discovered inscriptions by Canaanite laborers working in the mines dating to the Middle Bronze Age, somewhere between the 18th and 17th centuries BC. The script appears to be an intermediary stage between hieroglyphics and alphabets that we know today, with each symbol representing a sound, but using pictures instead. So let's take a look. As we can see in Proto-Sinaitic, each letter is pictographic. A picture of an object is used to represent the sound at the beginning of the corresponding word. So, for example, the initial letter in the alphabet, Aleph, was written as an ox head. This is based on the word for ox in West Semitic languages, which begins with that letter, so it may just represent the first sound in the word. Most, if not all, letters in the Hebrew alphabet began in this way. Ugaritic is also related to Proto-Sinaitic. Scholars note that scribes in Ugarit apparently adapted the pictographic alphabet into alphabetic cuneiform. Ugaritic uses 30 cuneiform signs to represent consonants rather than words or syllables. This system vastly simplifies literacy, requiring a literate person to only memorize a couple dozen signs, each with one phonetic meaning, instead of memorizing hundreds of signs that could have had a wide range of meanings. Over time, the writing of these letters became more fluid, almost like modern-day cursive, where they only slightly resembled their original forms or looked nothing like them at all. This alphabet is not only the ancestor of the Hebrew alphabet, but also the Latin alphabet used in languages like English today. Going back to the example for the word aleph, the later stylized version looks much like a V with a line through it, representing the ox's horns. Over time, the letters of the alphabet rotated 180 degrees. Looking at our modern capital A, if you picture it flipped upside down, you can picture a rough sketch of an animal's head with horns. The Proto-Sinaitic script then can be considered not only a common ancestor of Hebrew, but also of other Semitic languages such as Arabic, as well as the common ancestor of Phoenician, Greek, Latin, and modern Western languages which use these alphabets today. So, whenever you write or type using this alphabet, remember to thank the peoples of the ancient Near East. Hey everyone, that was the latest episode in my series Excavating the History of the Bible, which I'm producing in collaboration with Patheos.com. Head on over and subscribe to the Patheos YouTube channel to view all past and future episodes of the series. The aim of the series is to examine the world of the Bible through a non-sectarian and academic lens. My methodology is based in archaeology and anthropology. I've collaborated with a whole team of field archaeologists and biblical scholars to produce each and every episode. Topics include the Canaanite origins of the Israelites, the emergence of the Philistine cities on the coast of the Levant, the rise of monotheism in the kingdom of Judah. So if these topics interest you, then head over to Patheos' channel. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching.
From letters on shards to stones stacked high, Herod enters with ambition carved in limestone. Temples soar, harbors stretch into the sea, and architecture becomes a language of power. Here's something remarkable. Herod expanded the Temple Mount into one of the largest sacred platforms in antiquity. And another, Caesarea's harbor was a feat of Roman engineering using hydraulic concrete. Ready for the next discovery?
Here's some footage of the fortress Masada, which overlooks the Dead Sea and the Judean desert, and some footage from the city of Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast, and Herodium, and the Western Wall. What do all of these sites have in common? Well, beside the fact that they are monumental works of ancient architecture, they were all constructed or renovated under the direction of one man, Herod the Great. For those of you that know your New Testament, Herod was the villain in the Gospel of Matthew's version of Jesus' birth. The Magi follow a star to Judea and consult King Herod, asking where the King of the Jews has been born, referring to Jesus, not Herod. Herod sees this as a threat to his rule, so according to the biblical account, he orders every male child in Bethlehem under the age of 2 to be killed. But aside from the baby-killing tyrant described in Matthew, what do we know about Herod the Great? Today we'll explore the twists and turns of Herod's rise to power and his fight to keep it. Based on what we know from the archaeological and textual evidence, Herod the Great was a complicated figure. On one hand, he was a subservient client king to the Roman Empire, and on the other hand, he was a brutal and calculating politician who forever changed the landscape of Judea through his rule. First of all, even though Herod eventually became king of Judea, Herod was actually not a Judean. He hailed from the land of Idumea, the descendants of the Edomites, one of Israel's ancient neighbors to the southeast, who had been forcibly converted to Judaism by the Hasmoneans, a dynasty that ruled the region following the Maccabean revolt a century before. The Judeans, under the rule of the Hasmonean dynasty, conquered this region in 73 BC, a few decades before Herod was born. So even though Herod was born an Idumean, he was raised in a family that had adopted Jewish customs and eventually rose to a position of power under the Hasmoneans. But Herod owes his own rise to power to the Roman Empire. In 63 BC, when Herod would have only been about 10 years old, the Romans toppled the Hasmonean dynasty, which cleared the stage for his rise. Herod's father was already a high-ranking official and allied himself with the Romans. Because of these connections, Herod was appointed the governor of Galilee in 47 BC, when he was only in his 20s. So how did he make the jump from governor to king? Well, this is where we see his political savvy come into play. He rose to king of Judea by exploiting the geopolitics between two superpowers, Parthia and Rome. At the time, the Parthians were the most pressing enemy of the Romans. They were the successors of the Persian Empire and had moved westward in the period following the disintegration of Alexander the Great's empire. In 40 BC, the Parthians overtook Jerusalem, attempting to reinstate the Hasmonean dynasty. They installed their own Hasmonean king of Judea, thinking that the populace would more easily accept a Hasmonean king. But Herod had connections too, specifically family connections with the Roman politician Mark Antony. With his help, Herod convinced the Roman Senate to name him king of the Jews, and he returned to Judea with the backing of the Roman army to oust the Parthians. Victory was not easy, but Jerusalem eventually fell to the Romans in 37 BC, and Herod began his work as a client king. So even though he was stuck in the middle between Parthia and Rome, he came out of the war with a kingship. Not bad. But this calculating political skill continued throughout his career and would make any character in Game of Thrones proud.
You're a sharp little thing, aren't you?
Later, when Mark Antony lost in a civil war to Caesar Augustus, Herod did not beg Augustus to forgive him for his alliance. Herod boldly stood before Augustus and said, "Hey, I'm so loyal I would have fought against you with Antony, even though I knew Antony was going to lose. You'll want this level of loyalty on your side." Next, Herod needed to solidify his rule over the Jewish people. Even though the Hasmoneans had been dethroned, Herod knew that his legitimacy as king was shaky as an Idumean, and as a client to Rome. His father's Idumean heritage meant that he was understood ethnically as only being half Jewish. The people he ruled longed for leaders who were fully Jewish and wanted to restore the earlier Hasmonean dynasty. So Herod married Mariamne, a surviving heir to the Hasmonean dynasty, in order to solidify his claim to the throne. Later, when he suspected she was plotting against him, he executed his own wife to secure his power. He also executed his own sons that he had with her. Like I said, he was a pretty brutal guy. Is it any wonder that the Roman Emperor Augustus is reported to have said, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son"? Herod might have kept a kosher table, but he did not hesitate to take out one of his own kids or his own wife if he perceived them as a threat to his power. Despite all of this brutality, though, Herod was a capable leader. Josephus tells us that he was a skilled general, consistently winning the battles he engaged in, and he was even an expert warrior himself, super skilled with both the bow and the javelin. During a period of famine and disease around 30 BC, he managed to create various programs to dole out food to the sick and old. He boosted local currency by melting his own gold, and he leveraged his political connections in Egypt to send aid to Judea. His success and influence as a ruler can be seen through his ambitious building projects too. Herod made at least 3 trips to Rome during his lifetime. The architectural renaissance of the city during the time of Augustus appears to have made a lasting impact on Herod. When Herod received additional land from Octavian after the Battle of Actium, Herod responded by commissioning a number of monumental building projects with the aim of demonstrating his loyalty to Rome and so as to secure his own power over Judea. He oversaw the construction of an impressive artificial harbor at Caesarea, built directly into open water. He also built a palace fortress at Masada, constructing fancy buildings on different terraces cut into the rock face. And most famously, he expanded the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But we'll return to this project in a later episode. While the temple renovations secured Jewish support for Herod's rule, it was the construction of new Roman-style cities that bolstered his connections to Rome and demonstrated his loyalty to the emperor. Herod had constructed a number of inland cities, palaces, and fortresses, all of which demonstrated his affinity for Roman architecture. Nevertheless, he desired the kind of cosmopolitan coastal port city that would connect him quickly to Roman lines of communication and demonstrate his abilities to build a truly Roman city. Caesarea Maritima, or Caesarea by the Sea, would become one of Herod's most magnificent accomplishments. Perhaps because of his Idumean heritage, or perhaps because he feared he would one day need to escape to the wilderness, Herod also constructed a number of desert palaces and fortresses. Among them, his cliff-top stronghold of Masada is the most memorable. Herod expanded the Hasmonean complex at Masada with walls, watchtowers, storage facilities, and large cisterns. The fortress included a big bath complex and 2 palaces. One is a striking cliffside palace that looked to the north, and the other on the western side of the mountaintop. Despite his significant investments, Herod would never need the site as a place of refuge after his initial clash with the Parthians. Almost a century after his death, Masada would become renowned as the place of a last stand by Jewish rebels against the Roman army. But the building project that Herod loved the most was the palace fortress known as Herodium. The partially man-made mound just south of Jerusalem juts up from the landscape, kind of like a volcano rising up from the ground. Built between 24 and 15 BC to commemorate the success over the Parthians, the site would become Herod's preferred administrative center in inland Judea. The mound, which was capped by a formidable 30-foot wall, served as both palace and fortress, while protecting 3 cisterns in the heart of the hill. The palace on its summit was visible from Jerusalem, where Herod's subjects could be reminded that their king was never too far away. Josephus suggests that Herod built these public works to raise his own reputation and memorialize himself forever. And it kind of worked. Over 2,000 years later, he's remembered as a larger-than-life figure. However, accounts of Herod's death indicate that his final days were actually filled with significant suffering. Josephus describes the various aspects of Herod's sickly condition, noting that Herod even attempted suicide by stabbing himself in order to speed up his own death. Herod died in Jericho in 4 BC. Tradition holds that Herod wanted his body buried at Herodium. Remains of a tomb-like structure have been found there, and even a piece of a large sarcophagus. But the actual remains of Herod, if they were ever there in the first place, are long since gone. Hey everyone, that was the latest episode in Patheos' series, Excavating the History of the Bible. You can catch up on all previous episodes by clicking the playlist here on screen.
Leaving Herod's monumental works, we drift north to Galilee's waters. Fishing boats, quiet harbors, and bustling villages frame a lake that anchors countless stories. Quick fact before we continue. A first-century boat found near the Sea of Galilee offers a glimpse of daily travel. And another, the harbor remains reveal trade networks connecting Galilee to the wider Mediterranean. Let's set sail for the next episode.
The BBC recently reported that the house of Jesus might have been found in Nazareth. Excavations in the Galilee region, beneath a church supposedly built on top of his childhood home, revealed remains of a house dating to the 1st century. But as with so many pop archaeology articles, the title of this piece is clickbait. Strong case house and crypt was home to Jesus, says archaeologist. A better title might be, archaeologists find proof of a standard domestic building with contents dating roughly to the 1st century CE. The archaeology of the Galilee and reporting about it often is sensationalized, but the Galilee is indeed home to some of the most exciting archaeological discoveries in recent history. The biblical scholar Sean Frayne once remarked that the search for the historical Jesus has turned into a search for the historical Galilee. By this he meant that scholars have stopped reading and rereading the New Testament Gospels to figure out what sort of person Jesus was, but have instead turned to archaeology to try and understand the historical context of the 1st century. So what do we know about Galilee beyond what's described in the Gospels? In this episode, we'll be discussing the region of the Galilee, its history, and what we know about the setting of Jesus' life. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian who was stationed in the Galilee during the First Jewish War, wrote that the Galilee has two divisions, known as Upper and Lower Galilee. This division between Upper and Lower is clearly visible in the landscape. While the Lower Galilee is formed by a series of fertile valleys, broken up by ranges of hills which run east to west, Upper Galilee, on the other hand, is far more mountainous. The Sea of Galilee is known by many names, including the Kinneret or the Lake of Tiberias. It's the second lowest lake in the world, being over 200 meters below sea level. It is fed in the north by the Jordan River, which continues its course at the southern tip of the sea. Here it runs south, down the Jordan Valley, and eventually into the world's lowest lake, the Dead Sea. In antiquity, the level of the Sea of Galilee was slightly higher than it is today because it's been used as a source of fresh water in recent times. Check out this photo. The red line shows roughly where the water's edge came in the 1st century. We know this from the remains of ancient docks around the lake. Here you can see where the edge of Magdala's harbor once lay, kind of far from the water's edge. The lake now measures 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide at its widest point. Another lake, or more of a marsh really, called Hula, once lay further north. This lake was drained during the 1950s as it was a source of mosquitoes that caused malaria. In antiquity, and up until quite recently, this would have been a common cause of death for people living in this area. During the Iron Age, Galilee was part of the territory of the northern kingdom of Israel. But in the 8th century, it was largely devastated by Assyria. Archaeologists believe that from this point, the Galilee was only lightly populated until the region was conquered by the Hasmonean dynasty, around 100 BC. Following this, the Hasmoneans established or rebuilt many settlements in the Galilee, notably towns like Magdala, Sepphoris, and Gamla. Sole Hasmonean rule over this region was short-lived. Later, in 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey the Great marched his legions through the Galilee. This was the first time where Roman power had been directly encountered in the area. Following this, Galilee became, for a short time, a self-determining region, with a local council based in Sepphoris. Herod the Great even saw the beginning of his political career in military exploits around Galilee, fighting against the remnants of the Hasmonean dynasty. After his ascension to the throne, he largely ignored the Galilee itself, instead building many cities and temples around the region. This situation lasted until his death in 4 BC, at which point his son was appointed by the Roman emperor as tetrarch over the Galilee. The archaeologist Andrea Berlin has described the material culture of Galilean towns as examples of household Judaism. This refers to the practice of people living in Judea, the Lower Galilee, and the southern Golan Heights, adopting identical material culture and practices that enabled people throughout a relatively large region to live in similar fashion and to project a shared cultural and ethnic identity. No longer did Judean simply mean someone living in Judea. It meant sharing an affiliation that we would call Judaism. So what are some examples of this household Judaism? Galilee and the Galileans were clearly interested in Jerusalem and its temple. All over the Galilee, archaeologists have discovered oil lamps crafted in and around Jerusalem. They may have been brought back like souvenirs by those who had visited the city. These lamps are often called Herodian oil lamps because they first appear around the end of Herod's reign. Another example of household Judaism is an impressive carved stone found inside the synagogue in the town of Magdala. This stone is thought to have been a representation of the Jerusalem temple, complete with architectural features and symbolic elements which are associated with items inside the temple, such as the menorah. Now, it's kind of surprising to hear that there are few clear remains of synagogues dating to the 1st century in the Galilee region, but the Magdala synagogue is an impressive exception. It was excavated relatively recently too, only in 2009. This building was richly decorated with frescoes and mosaics, and it probably could have held about 100 people, maybe 150 if they squeezed in, which is interesting because the town itself maybe had around 10,000 people, which means that only a small percentage of the population would have been able to sit in on the synagogue meetings. Many artifacts found in the Galilee relate to ancient Jewish ideas about ritual purity as well. These include ritual immersion pools called mikveh, designed to remove ritual impurity. Archaeologists have also discovered stone vessels which, according to later rabbinic Judaism, were immune from becoming impure. An early reference to this kind of idea might be found in the Gospel of John. It mentions, "Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Curiously, the Gospels do not spend a lot of time discussing what would have been the major towns in the Galilee, like Sepphoris or Tiberias. Rather, most of the places where Jesus is said to have visited tend to be smaller towns and villages. One well-known place is called Capernaum, or the village of Nahum. This town sits along the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and during the first century it was a fishing village, home to perhaps 1,000 people at most. Many objects associated with ancient fishing have been found in excavations, such as fish hooks, stone anchor weights, and line weights. Archaeologists have noted that a particular first-century house was developed into a church in later centuries, possibly because it was associated with Simon Peter's house, though this is impossible to confirm. There's also a big limestone synagogue in Capernaum, but it dates to around the 4th or 5th centuries. There are some thick basalt walls and pavements underneath the limestone synagogue that some people think belong to an earlier 1st century synagogue, but again, we're not sure. The relatively rural nature of ancient Galilee meant that the economy in the 1st century was largely agricultural, supplemented with fishing. Magdala itself was probably a fishing village, as well as Capernaum. And hammering this home is a striking find from the sea itself, a boat recovered from the northwestern edge that likely dates to the 1st century. The vessel is over 8 meters long, and subsequent analysis revealed that no less than 12 different types of wood were used to build or repair it. Recent excavation projects have uncovered some unexpected discoveries, like the Magdala Synagogue stone, that show us just how rich some places were and the connections which were fostered between Galilee and Jerusalem. Galilee was a diverse place and experienced lots of changes between the 2nd century BCE and the 2nd century CE. It not only was the setting of Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, but also the center of early rabbinic Judaism, where textual traditions like the Mishnah and Tosefta were written down, and a vibrant culture of synagogue construction occurred, where artistic decoration flourished. Now, of course, there are still a lot of things we don't know about the ancient Galilee, but we are beginning to get a sense of what the region was like during the 1st century. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. That was the latest episode in Patheos' series, Excavating the History of the Bible. Click on the playlist on screen to catch up on all previous episodes.
From Galilee's shoreline to Jerusalem's crowded streets, the Second Temple era hums with life. Pilgrims ascend, markets buzz, and ritual baths line the roads to sacred space. Here's something to note. Archaeology maps mikvaot, ritual baths, near the temple precinct. And another, streets lined with market stalls serve thousands of pilgrims during festivals. Let's walk into Jerusalem's past.
In the Gospels, the city of Jerusalem is the backdrop to several significant events in Jesus' life. It was the city where the baby Jesus was brought for his presentation at the temple. Later in life, it's where he threw out money changers in the temple court, and where he spent the final days before his crucifixion. If you visit the old city of Jerusalem today, especially during a Christian holiday like Easter, you'll see Christian pilgrims walking through the narrow streets on the Via Dolorosa, the traditional path that Jesus took on his way to his crucifixion. However, because the city has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, this city has been built up century after century. Most of the Roman-era city is actually below the current street level. Moreover, the imposing walls of the old city date to the Ottoman period and don't even enclose the entire ancient city. So what was Jerusalem like during Jesus' life? One man in particular played a huge role in shaping the skyline of Jesus' Jerusalem: Herod the Great. If you remember from a previous episode, Herod was the politically savvy yet brutal king of Judea. Although Herod only overlapped with Jesus' life for a few years, Herod sponsored a bunch of building projects in Jerusalem that shaped the city for decades to come. This means that Jesus' Jerusalem was basically Herod's Jerusalem. Let's start with the Temple Mount, which was to become the crowning jewel of Herod's Jerusalem-based building program. When the Judeans returned from the Babylonian exile in the 500s BC, they rebuilt and reconsecrated the temple that the Babylonians had destroyed. By the time Herod came to power, this second temple was 500 years old, and he saw this as an opportunity to solidify his rule over Judea. So he sponsored a huge expansion of the Temple Mount. Today, the Temple Mount, called the Haram al-Sharif by Muslims, is home to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, two holy centers for Muslims today. And you can see from these aerial photographs that the sanctuary is a rectangular plaza. This general shape harkens back to the vast esplanade that was part of Herod's building project. The final product, which wasn't entirely finished until well after Herod died, was one of the largest sacred precincts in the ancient world, covering approximately 140,000 square meters. To the north, the bedrock was cut back to make room for the platform, while to the south, the bedrock drops in elevation, so a system of underground vaults were constructed to support the massive platform above. Herod enclosed the platform with a boundary wall referred to in Greek as a temenos. It's part of this temenos wall that is known today as the Kotel, or the Western Wall. Several gates in the temenos wall provide access to the Temple Mount, most notably the Hulda gates on the southern end of the plaza. Two sets of stairs of alternating wide and narrow steps led up to the gates. This purposely awkward spacing forced visitors to the temple to slow their pace, intentionally designed to force people into a state of reverence while approaching the sacred precinct. Other archaeological finds from around the Temple Mount attest to its status as a sacred space. For example, non-Jews were not allowed to enter the temple based on both textual and archaeological evidence. Archaeologists have discovered two inscriptions that must have been part of a stone fence around the temple that prohibited non-Jews from entering the space. One reads, "No man of another nation is to enter within the fence and enclosure around the temple, and whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his death, which will follow." The Jewish historian Josephus might reference this same fence when he wrote, "In this at regular intervals stood slabs giving warning, some in Greek and others in Latin characters, of the law of purification, that no foreigner was permitted to enter the holy place." Around the Temple Mount, archaeologists have also discovered ritual pools called mikveh, where Jews would immerse themselves to cleanse ritual impurity. The archaeologist Jody Magnus says that Jerusalem is home to among the largest mikvahs discovered, as well as the largest concentration of mikvahs. These were not only situated around the Temple Mount, but also along pilgrimage routes into Jerusalem and in the residences of Jerusalem's elite. And because mikvahs need water, Herod was also responsible for the expansion of the city's water supply, expanding the size of the pre-existing water reservoirs and adding several new ones. The water brought into the city was used not just for drinking and cooking, but also to fill the city's large concentration of mikvahs. The Pool of Siloam, which the Gospel of John mentions as where Jesus heals a blind man, might have been a massive immersion pool for pilgrims as well. During the 1st century, a bridge connected the Temple Mount with the wealthy residential district of the upper city. Scholars suggest that the remains of this bridge can be seen in the tunnels underneath the modern street level up against the Western Wall. You can see it here, an arch called Wilson's Arch, named after the explorer Charles Wilson. Down here in the tunnels, you can also see the largest stones in the Western Wall, weighing several hundred tons. And it's down here that some of the most exciting ongoing excavations are occurring, like the recent discovery of a Roman theater-like structure under Wilson's Arch. When the Romans sacked the city in the year 70, they destroyed the buildings on top of the platform. Today, nothing survives of the temple building itself, so artistic reconstructions of the temple are based mostly on descriptions provided by Josephus and Talmudic sources. Jerusalem was not only a city for pilgrims, though. Apparently, it was also a prime spot to be buried. A vast necropolis, or city of the dead, surrounded Jerusalem to its north, east, and south during the 1st century. Within a radius of 3 miles of the city walls, 1,000 tombs have been discovered, 800 of which date to the Herodian period. The vast majority of these tombs belong to the city's elite, and most of the tombs in these cemetery complexes were carved out of the natural rock. 3 of the most elaborate tombs are located in the Kidron Valley, at the foot of the Mount of Olives. Inside many of these tombs, the dead were typically buried in niches carved into the rock called loculi. This form of burial was introduced to the region during the Hellenistic period and remained popular until the sack of the city in the year 70. To allow for the greatest number of burials within a tomb, the loculi would be cut perpendicular to the wall, forming deep shelves in the rock. During the Herodian period, sarcophagi appeared to have been restricted to only a few of the most luxurious burials. Smaller stone boxes called ossuaries were far more popular, with several thousand discovered in Jerusalem alone. The evidence suggests that the ossuaries were used as a secondary form of burial. Literary sources from the period state that about 1 year after the initial burial, once the body had decomposed, the bones of the deceased would be collected and relocated to a separate permanent tomb. Artisans within Jerusalem carved the ossuaries from local limestone, decorating them with floral and geometric motifs. Some of the ossuaries were inscribed with the names of the deceased, mostly in Aramaic and Greek, but occasionally in Hebrew as well. One of the most prominent examples is the so-called Caiaphas ossuary, a bone box inscribed with the name Joseph, son of Caiaphas, which might reference the high priest mentioned in the New Testament. Today, what we know of Jesus' Jerusalem is largely focused on its greater infrastructure and the lives and afterlives of its wealthiest citizens. With archaeological investigations ongoing, our understanding of the ancient city is constantly evolving. New discoveries will be made that will write or even rewrite its history as we know it today. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. That was the latest episode in Patheos' series, Excavating the History of the Bible. Click on the playlist on screen to catch up on all previous episodes.
From festival throngs to fortress heights, the revolt reaches Gamla. Basalt cliffs bristle with defenses, coins whisper of hope, and Rome's siege leaves scars etched in stone. Quick fact before we continue. Coins minted at Gamla help date its final stand during the revolt, and other fortifications carved into the rocky slopes made Gamla a stronghold until Rome's siege. Time to climb into history.
You may have heard about the First Jewish War against Rome. The most famous stories from this war include how the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, or the rebels' last stand at the desert fortress Masada. In this episode, we will discuss the outbreak of this war, as well as a lesser-known battle at the ancient town of Gamla, where history and archaeology provide a window into the workings of a first-century Roman siege. The First Jewish War broke out during the year 66 and ended in 73. It began after an escalating series of small conflicts between the Judeans who objected to Roman governance, which was often capricious and sometimes outright sadistic, and Judeans who generally supported Roman rule. The anti-Roman factions gained support when the Roman authorities decided to take valuables from the temple treasury to cover taxation payments from the region. In response to this, wide-scale resistance and revolt flared up. Pro-Roman forces in Judea were quickly overrun, as many towns and fortresses were captured. Cestius Gallus, a Roman general, led an armed force from its station in Syria down into Judea, but he suffered a major defeat in the year 66, boosting anti-Roman sentiments. The war had begun, and it was off to a good start for the rebels. The war was also a significant moment in early Roman imperial history. Following this first crushing defeat, the Roman Emperor Nero appointed the general Titus Flavius Vespasian to suppress the revolt. Landing in Acco in spring of 67, Vespasian and his armies quickly suppressed the Galilee. But while Vespasian was campaigning and in command of one of the largest forces in the Roman Empire, Nero died. This began a series of revolts with men trying to clamor for the top job. Vespasian was the last of these men to claim the empire for himself, being proclaimed emperor in July of 69. To solidify his claim, he left the region and placed his son, Titus, another future emperor, to conclude the suppression efforts. While many are familiar with the story of Masada, the mountaintop palace and later fortress which continued to resist the Roman legions until 73, Gamla is less well known. Gamla is a site located in the Golan Heights, and which has sometimes been called the Masada of the North. However, the stories of these sieges are quite different. While Masada was a mountaintop fortress, easily defendable and well supplied with food and water, Gamla was a provincial settlement, home to many families and ill-prepared for a long-term siege. The name for the town comes from the shape of the ridge it was built on, Gamla, or Gamala, being derived from the Aramaic word for camel. Some people say that the ridge looks kind of like the back of a camel. The steep hillside means that the buildings were constructed along terraces, and the only easy way to enter the town is from the northeast. Gamla is also home to what most scholars consider one of the earliest known synagogue buildings. This impressive structure measures about 20 by 16 meters. It could hold somewhere between 400 and 540 people at any given time. The floor plan of the main hall is divided between an upper and lower level, and benches encircle the whole synagogue, which provides seating. Although Gamla was not a fortress, the town was strategically located. Steep cliffs prevented easy access from almost every direction except the northeast. Visitors today can see the remains of a wall blocking access to the town along this ridge. This wall was only fully constructed in preparation for the revolt, but the word wall is probably giving it a little bit too much credit. Rather, the gaps between pre-existing buildings were bridged to prevent access, and rooms whose outer walls became part of the defenses were filled with rocks to thicken the fortifications. At the outbreak of the war, Gamla experienced an influx of refugees. Evidence of temporary fire pits used for cooking have been found in many of the larger buildings across the town, including inside the synagogue. Josephus, who provides a first-hand account of the siege, writes that the population grew from an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 people to around 9,000 people. Josephus is our key source for the events of the First Jewish War, and he himself participated in the initial events and witnessed many of the things he reported. He also provides us with two slightly different accounts, one in his work The Jewish War and one in his later published autobiography. These works contain a bunch of differences, but generally speaking, it can be seen that Josephus tries to show how the war was doomed to fail against the might of the Roman armies. It should also be noted that during an earlier siege, Josephus was captured and imprisoned by the Romans, but having gained favor with Vespasian, he was released to accompany the general and became a kind of informant for the Romans. He was taken into Vespasian's household, taking the names Titus Flavius in honor of his patrons. His works are therefore small examples of Flavian propaganda, pumping up the figures of Vespasian and Titus and highlighting their military prowess. As a prisoner, Josephus was present for the whole 30 days of the Roman siege. Gamla had already been blockaded for 7 months by pro-Roman forces, so things were already getting pretty desperate by the time the Roman armies showed up. Josephus knew the details of the Roman siege and also the layout of Gamla, claiming to have fortified the town during his activities at the outbreak of the war. 3 Roman legions took part in the siege, and they destroyed the town in either September or October of 67. Vespasian himself is reported to have almost died, but was saved through the quick implementation of a Roman testudo formation, being barricaded behind a wall of shields. Josephus's own account ends the siege with a dramatic and tragic scene. Seeing that the Romans had overrun the defenses, the inhabitants committed suicide by throwing themselves into the ravine below the town's citadel. Josephus writes that 5,000 people died in this way, while the remaining 4,000 people were slaughtered by the Romans. But let's set aside Josephus and ask, what can archaeology tell us? Well, first, there are no traces of Roman camps around the town. It could be that these camps were temporary and were dismantled, or they have since worn away. Thus, the Romans were probably not expecting a long siege, setting up the most temporary of encampments. While Gamla can only be accessed from the northeast, providing natural barriers to other routes, this also means that it was an easy site to isolate. Furthermore, Gamla's wall was essentially a hot mess. It is no coincidence that the Romans broke down the wall at its thinnest point. Excavations have revealed a clear breach in the walls in a building below the synagogue. Around 300 arrowheads and 180 stone ballista balls have been recovered from this breach, showing the intensity of the bombardment. The wall in this place was nearly 2 meters thick, but it was also one of the weakest spots along the whole wall. The Roman engineers chose well. Archaeologists have also discovered around 2,000 ballista balls, 1,600 arrowheads, and 100 catapult bolts. Most of these projectiles were found in the 50-meter segment of the wall that was breached. Sword scabbards, spear points, shield pieces, decorations, and pendants have also been reported from around the town, mostly in and around the wall. In this video, you can see a replica of the ballista catapult. Stores of ballista balls were recovered around 300 meters from the edge of the walls, roughly where this example has been constructed. Roman ballistas could fire projectiles between 400 and 500 meters, putting them beyond the range of defensive fire from bows and arrows. They would be used as they were at Gamla, to batter down walls and kill defenders. Josephus' account of the final events does not seem to match up with the topography of the town. While there is a ravine, it's not large enough to accommodate such a large number of people. Moreover, very few human remains have been discovered at the town. It is probably more likely that people escaped down the ravines or were taken captive. The historian Kenneth Atkinson suggests that Josephus created the story of the mass suicide to lend nobility to what were likely two disgraceful defeats. In other words, Josephus may have deployed a literary trope of Judeans committing suicide rather than suffer enslavement at the hands of the Romans, as a way to bring honor to an otherwise dishonorable defeat. Josephus made a similar choice in his depiction of the final stand at Masada, another account for which some scholars have significant doubts. So ends the story of Gamla. Not quite a Masada, but an example of an ancient Jewish town containing evidence of economic activity, communal worship, the efficacy of Roman military tactics, and ultimately Jewish resistance to Roman power. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. That was the latest episode in Patheos' series, Excavating the History of the Bible. Click on the playlist on screen to catch up on all previous episodes.
From strongholds to synagogues, the story widens to the diaspora. Inscriptions speak of God-fearers bridging cultures as faith travels along trade routes and urban streets. Here's something fascinating. Inscriptions using the term Theosebes mark communities at the edges of diaspora life. And another, these God-fearers often acted as cultural bridges between Jewish and Greco-Roman worlds. Let's explore the final chapter.
In the 13th chapter of the New Testament book, the Acts of the Apostles, the Apostle Paul travels to the city of Antioch of Pisidia, located in Western Asia Minor. There he visited the synagogue to try to persuade the people that Jesus was the promised Messiah, a man from the line of King David himself. However, before Paul launches into his speech, notice how he addresses his audience. So Paul stood up and motioning with his hand said, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen." That's kind of odd language. Why would Paul say, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God"? If he was speaking to a Jewish audience, this might seem like a redundant statement. Well, the phrase translated from the Greek as "you who fear God" might actually be a technical term, a term referring to non-Jewish people who were interested in Jewish beliefs and practices. So interested that they would actually attend synagogue meetings, even when they had not yet converted themselves. The book of Acts consistently differentiates between Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as Paul bounces from one synagogue to another around the Mediterranean. For example, in Acts 17, he arrives in Thessalonica, and upon visiting the synagogue, he convinces both Jews and Greeks. Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the God-fearing Greeks. Again, notice that word God-fearing, and notice the differentiation between Jews and Greeks. Variations of this phrase, God-fearing or pious, appear again and again in the book of Acts, and seem to reference these Greeks and Romans who were interested in Jewish customs. Josephus mentions a similar phenomenon. In his book, The Jewish War, he mentions non-Jewish women in the city of Damascus adopting Jewish religious practice. And he says that the Jews in the city of Antioch always drew to their religious ceremonies a great multitude of Greeks whom they made in some way a part of themselves. As we see in these texts, non-Jews were apparently attending local synagogues and affiliating with local Jewish communities outside of Judea. This might point to the social context of Paul's so-called missionary journeys, traveling to local synagogues and finding a receptive audience among so-called non-Jewish God-fearers. But do we see something similar in the archaeological record? So far in this series, we focus mostly on the regions in and around Judea, and there are some prominent examples of ancient synagogues in this region. There is a synagogue at Masada, a beautifully preserved example on the shores of the Sea of Galilee at the town of Magdala, and another example in the Golan Heights at the town of Gamla. But in the book of Acts, Paul visits synagogues in the other corners of the Roman Empire, Syria, Asia Minor, and Greece. Scholars sometimes call these Jewish communities the Jewish diaspora, referring to the Jews living outside of Judea. And sure enough, archaeologists have discovered ancient synagogues all over the Mediterranean world. One example was discovered in the city of Priene, located in western Asia Minor. There, the Jewish community converted a house into a synagogue. Archaeologists discovered a niche in the wall where they once kept their Torah scroll, as well as several images of the menorah engraved in the stones of the synagogue. Another prominent example is the synagogue in the city of Sardis, located northeast of Priene. There, archaeologists discovered a huge synagogue that dates to around the 3rd or 4th century, consisting of a long assembly hall and an impressive shrine for the Torah scroll. So even though they are relatively rare, diaspora synagogues are archaeologically attested throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. But what evidence do we have for non-Jewish people joining the community? Over the decades, several inscriptions have come to light using the epithet God-fearer or God-fearing, which might be archaeological evidence of the technical term that we saw in our textual evidence. Many of these inscriptions are dedications from wealthy benefactors in the community. For example, check out this inscription from Tralles in Western Asia Minor, which is a dedication from a pagan woman who paid to refurbish the local synagogue. This is a donor inscription. A modern analogy would be a rich philanthropist donating money to a building project on a college campus. Sometimes the whole building is named after the philanthropist, or sometimes just a single room, and sometimes you'll just see plaques on the wall or stone pavers that name the donors. This example from Tralles is kind of the same idea. Some woman named Capitolina, probably a wealthy local benefactor, donated to the synagogue. She was a member of a powerful local family that included a proconsul of Asia Minor, and her husband apparently was a senator and a priest of Zeus. In other words, this woman was probably pagan, but she calls herself a God-fearer, using a Greek word related to the same word used in the book of Acts to describe God-fearing Greeks. Thus, she may have been one of these non-Jewish individuals curious about Jewish customs, and who loosely affiliated herself with the community. Donor inscriptions happen to be the most common attestation of God-fearers in the Roman Empire. At the Sardis synagogue that I mentioned earlier, archaeologists discovered 6 inscriptions that labeled donors as God-fearers. 2 of the inscriptions were prominently displayed in a fancy mosaic in the synagogue's entryway. Another example was discovered in the city of Aphrodisias, where archaeologists found 2 big marble blocks listing the names of dozens of people who had donated to the Jewish community. It lists 68 Jews, 3 proselytes, and 54 people called God-fearers. These 2 terms, proselyte and God-fearers, appear to be 2 technical categories within the Jewish community. Now, although much of this evidence dates to a few centuries after Paul, many scholars believe that these inscriptions can help us understand the social context of early Christianity, help us understand how it developed in the 1st century. Though it started as a sect of Judaism, the early Jesus movement apparently attracted new members from pagans that were involved in local Jewish communities. This is one reason why the scholar of early Christianity, Paula Fredrickson, calls Paul the pagan's apostle. Although he was Jewish and operated in Jewish communities, he also found an audience among the non-Jewish inhabitants of the Roman Empire as he traveled across the Eastern Mediterranean. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. That was the latest episode in Patheos' series, Excavating the History of the Bible. Click on the playlist on screen to catch up on all previous episodes.